fight back!
Over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's there's just it's there. It's there for you. And it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff. And you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great. Our book today is From Slave Ship to Supermax, Mass Incarceration, Prisoner Abuse, and the New Neo-Slave Model by Patrick Elliott Alexander. This is Chapter 1. Talking in George Jackson's Shadow is the title, If Beale Street Could Talk. Prison preoccupied the literary imagination of James Baldwin. Yet his biographer David Leeming is one of the few to notice that prisons and prisoners were a significant part of Baldwin's own personal experience. Even the most cursory glance at Baldwin's published works and interviews bear out Leeming's important observation. In his essay Equal in Paris, 1955, Baldwin reveals that during his time in France, he was, quote, arrested as a receiver of stolen goods and spent 8 days in prison. While confined, Baldwin witnessed with great shock another incarcerated man's bleeding and wounding go unattended intentionally by prison staff. In his longer essay, No Name on the Street, 1972, Baldwin reflects on frequent prison visits that he made to his friend Tony Maynard, a black man who suffered violent treatment from guards after he was falsely accused with the murder of a white U.S. Marine. Baldwin's advocacy for black political prisoners in particular deeply informed his writings and public addresses throughout the 1970s and included actions such as aiding in the release of imprisoned Black Panther Party co-founders Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. In 1970, Baldwin was so outraged by the appearance of Angela Davis, the black revolutionary and advocate for political prisoners, in handcuffs and mock mugshot posture on the cover of Newsweek magazine, that he published an open letter to the New York Review of Books in which he deemed her jailing a continuation of slavery and a foreshadowing of a radicalized epidemic of mass incarceration at the same time. Quote, only a handful of the millions of people in this vast place are unaware that the fate intended for you, Sister Angela, and for the numberless prisoners in our concentration camps, for that is what they are, is a fate which is about to engulf them too, end quote. When Baldwin spoke out about racism in the criminal justice system in the Dick Cavett Show in 1973, he won widespread admiration among imprisoned black communities, receiving, quote, so many letters from them that he determined to arrange a Christmas version of his musical drama, The Hallelujah Chorus, that would tour American prisons. Finally, in 1982, Baldwin published a letter in which he insisted that artists and prisoners have more in common with one another than have servants of the state. Baldwin was a stranger neither to witnessing nor to writing about prisons and prisoner abuse. Yet Baldwin's oeuvre had not been examined extensively in the context of his engagements with the literature and life experiences of imprisoned men and women. This chapter focuses on Baldwin's understanding of prisoner abuse and police intimidation as interrelated, radicalized social control functions of the contemporary U.S. carceral state, and pays careful attention to how his historicizing of radicalized state violence in fiction is shaped by his admiring engagement with the writings of imprisoned intellectuals. Baldwin, I contend, alludes to the human chattel conditioning, disciplinary violence, and economic exploitation that typified the institution of slavery in his Black liberation movement era short stories and novels to situate his Black working-class characters' subjection to racial profiling, police brutality, wrongful incarceration, indefinite solitary confinement, prisoner abuse, and premature death in racialized historical context. Focusing mostly on Baldwin's novel If Beale Street Could Talk, 1974, this chapter explores how Baldwin, inspired by the narrative techniques of the imprisoned intellectual George Jackson, links a repressive logic of racial terror from the era of antebellum slavery with the state's practice of white supremacist social control into the contemporary criminal justice system. I argue that by incorporating Baldwin's conception of neo-slavery into the elusive framework for Beale Street, Baldwin elucidates the predictability, rather than the aberrant nature, of Black men's hypercriminalization, incarceration, and brutalization by the state. Beale Street thus exemplifies well what I theorized in the introduction as a neo-abolitionist novel. With this work, Baldwin becomes the first canonical African-American writer to construct a conceptual model of the prison-industrial complex in fiction that privileges the narrative viewpoint of its captives while also making apparent slavery's vestiges in the contemporary U.S. criminal justice system. My point of departure for this chapter is Baldwin's career-length consideration of racial terror as a state-sanctioned social control function of both pre- and post-slavery American life, and the relationship of this instrumentalist terror to Blacks' recurring encounters with state violence in the late 20th and 21st centuries. This contextualization establishes a broader framework within which my reading of criminalization and punishment in Beale Street might be understood. Baldwin's witnessing of the physical, psychological, and spiritual harm that the criminalized Black body endures at the hands of the state shows up prominently in his nonfiction works as well. In his book-length essay, No Name in the Street, for instance, Baldwin's assessment of wounds that prison guards inflict on his former driver and bodyguard, Tony Maynard, a wrongfully incarcerated Black man, is characteristically disturbing and damning. The book, From Slave Ship to Supermax.
This to the show is online. The Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Good morning, TPS students. It is testing week, and it's time to slay all day.
Yeet. Stay woke, be on fleek, and get that Gucci breakfast.
Goals. Say bye, Felicia, to that testing stress. Weather's going to be turned, right, Chris?
Yes! Toledo weather going to be V-lit during testing week. A hundo-P chance of success. You've got this, kids. Steve, how about that traffic? Are we looking
better than we're talking turn. FOMO won't be an issue. No traffic problems around any TPS schools to keep you from taking those tests.
Hello, everybody. It's Anything Goes Friday. And if you weren't sure it was Anything Goes Friday, you haven't been tuning in for the last about 90 seconds. The call-in number today is 202-808-9925, 202-808-9925. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I am Jefferson Smith. It is the last day of spring break. It is the last day. It is day 5 of my 5-day stint here. So we've got a lot of stuff to cover, including your phone calls. And we appreciate you being a part of the show. It has been a lot of fun this week. We've been dealing with a lot of challenging things this week. Been honored to do it. Today, so that we can get to our Hundo P chance of success, today we're going to be dealing with a few questions that are part of my Anything Goes Friday. Does policy matter? Is it worth it to get into the weeds? This is sort of the Beto O'Rourke versus Elizabeth Warren question. Is it more about hopping on tables or more about coming up with policy papers? I'll offer my view. Also today, want to deal with one of your questions, which is, who are these people? Understanding the right wing. We won't deal with every element of that, but we will get at least a little bit into the weeds on that question. Had a conservative caller yesterday that wanted to hear from, but I knew it was going to be more than a 30-second thing. Would invite you to call again today. 202-808-9925. Also, we'll be doing Watch Your Language today. And I'll be explaining that in just a moment. And some news. Brexit failed again. Not a hundo P chance of success for Brexit. Much less than a hundo P. And I suppose because it's one of the bigger stories in the world, I should talk about it a little bit. We'll talk about Stephen Moore. You know who that is? New appointee to the Fed? We should say something about that. And that'll connect with this question of understanding the right wing a little bit. Every great cause begins as a movement, becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. Eric Hoffer said that. Now, I don't agree with all of Hoffer's stuff. He wrote True Believer. Ronald Reagan gave him an award. He, in the wake of the rise of communist dictatorship in the Soviet Union and the recent fall of fascist dictatorship in Germany and Italy, he wrote True Believer about mass movements. He made a couple points that I think are worth us remembering and keeping in mind. A couple of things I think we might quibble with. I'll say my greatest disagreement with Hoffer. My greatest disagreement with Hoffer is that he acknowledges that there have been some good mass movements, spends a little bit of time on that, and lists some number, but then spends almost the entirety of the book talking about how mass movements are bad. I think that is a little bit clumsy. I think he has been too roundly praised in the intellectual press because I think instead of just calling them mass movements, he needed to come up with another word. He said, well, there's good ones and bad ones, but then he used one word and then mostly talked about how they were bad. And if I had just had to live through World War II and live through the rise of the Nazi Party, I suppose I wouldn't be thinking as much either about the civil rights movement or about the consumer rights movement or about the women's rights movement or the suffrage movement. But nonetheless, he has some stuff that's brilliant. It's important. One is this idea of the potential for causes to degenerate into a racket. And I want to talk about the right wing, both in its ideal desire, design, its objectives, what it might say that it is, and also remind people of the Hoffer, and Hoffer was part of the same society that Friedrich Hayek, F.A. Hayek, was part of, that Milton Friedman was a part of. He was not of that same ilk in every way, but how movements can degenerate. But also these reminders from Hoffer. Not quoting, paraphrasing. The new poor are the most likely source of converts for negative mass movements. They recall their former wealth with resentment and blame others for their current misfortunes. Examples include the mass evictions of the relatively prosperous tenants during the English Civil War of the 1600s, or the middle and working classes in Germany who passionately supported Hitler in the 1930s after suffering years of economic hardship. New poor. People who've lost some degree of their social position. Sound familiar? In Germany during the 1920s and 1930s, when communists and fascists were ostensibly bitter enemies, but in fact competed for many of the same type of angry, marginalized people. Nazi Adolf Hitler and communist Karl Radek, and I never met the man, I may be mispronouncing his name, all boasted of their prowess in converting their rivals. I've been thinking about the Overton window and the current debate and the calls we've had over the week saying, we aren't as divided as we think. And so much of the political apparatus, so much of the media apparatus is built to divide us, to offer heat rather than light. And I have a view, and our listeners have a view, and I believe very strongly that climate change isn't only half real, and that wealth disparities aren't only half a problem, and that same-sex marriage isn't only half moral. I have a view, but I don't think that our view should be that we try primarily to profit from dividing one another. And the lesson of history of exploiting the newly weakened in order to join a negative movement, a potentially oppressive movement, and that you might even compete not merely based on the adjacency or similarity of your ideology or your policy program, but of your emotional appeal, and that could get us to embrace, and by us I just mean lots of human beings, to embrace destructive movements. It's something we should keep in mind. And also this, from Hoffer. Successful mass movements need not believe in a God, but they must believe in a devil. Hatred unifies the true believers. And now I am quoting, the ideal devil is a foreigner, attributed with nearly supernatural powers of evil. Does that sound familiar? As we try to shed ourselves, or at least weaken, our own sexism, our own misogyny, our own racism, our own xenophobia, our own ethnocentrism, let's make sure also that we understand people with different viewpoints. Doesn't mean we have to find the midpoint. We have to understand that our purpose is to solve problems, to make democracy a little bit better rather than a lot worse, and that and if we are listening to Kant going to purpose, our purpose is not to destroy, our purpose is not to divide, but our purpose is a better democracy. We'll be back. This is Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. Calls are lighting up, 202-808-9925. Carrie, you're on Free Speech TV from New Windsor, New York. It's Anything Goes Friday. Speak your piece.
Happy Women's History Month.
Happy Women's History Month.
It's almost over.
We have another, what is the day today? Is it the 29th today? We have another couple of days.
Yep. So they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Yep.
I was wondering, in order for there to be equality between men and women, what kind of things can we do differently? Like, for example, for Women's History Month, like, can we plan ahead to do something different than we did last year or something for next year? Or?
Do you have that's helpful. Do you have one that you're thinking about, either that you're doing or that you're advising for others?
Well, I've been motivated by the Me Too movement to, start speaking out more, but unfortunately I experienced a lot of backlash.
Yeah.
So I need help from men to speak up when they see stuff happening and not be bystanders, and that includes just when women receive repeated verbal advances from men, and that's to me mini rapes. And I'm wondering at this point, since women have a habit of putting everybody else before themselves, and et cetera, do women need to die at this point? How brown-skinned people got lynched and finally they got a president. So or is rape enough to shut us up? Let's not kill women. Let's just rape them, and then they'll be so quiet we can still look at them because they're pretty. We can still have them around, but
I want to give at least a little bit of trigger warning to to folks who are listening. But I appreciate the call a lot, and I don't want to wax expert. I want to avoid the mansplain part of the mansplaining. I do have a thought in my comfortable realm of like policy stuff, and which doesn't address the sins that I and many other men have inflicted upon women and upon humanity for centuries, and that doesn't erase the emotional pain that we have caused.
That's all in the past. I'm talking about moving forward. What kind of idea?
Here's
do you
one. Okay,
have?
Here is one. It doesn't, and I don't pretend for a moment that it erases rape culture, but at least it's one thing we can do differently as we move forward, and that is, let us be careful how we evaluate leadership. This might be a small thing, but I think it's an enormous thing. I'll use a few examples. Beto O'Rourke jumps on a table and gets a lot of attention for jumping on a table. Says, that's what a leader looks like. He uses his size, he uses his volume. I have size, I have volume. I know that if I am in a crowded room, I can be a little taller and significantly louder than almost anybody in the room. And I know that when I do that, somebody can look and say, that's what leadership looks like. Well, the challenge is it for somebody who isn't quite as big, who isn't quite as loud, who doesn't jump up on tables? Well, do they not look like a leader? Meanwhile, when Harvard Business Review did their analysis of leadership, so much of the charismatic leadership traits, including size and volume, did not indicate better results. We need to differentiate. We need to have a new and better and more nurturing understanding of what leadership looks like if we're ever going to elect a woman president and if we're ever going to fight misogyny better than we are now. I have more to say. We'll be back. It is the end of Women's History Month. Had a call off the air just a moment ago saying, what are things that we can do differently? One thought is, how do we evaluate leadership differently? And if we evaluate leadership only through a lens of patriarchal norms, only through what presidents have looked like and sounded like, then we will be direly limited in how we bend the arc of history towards justice. A lot of other things to talk about today, but that's at least one. Call-in numbers 202-808-9925, 202-808-9925. It is Anything Goes Friday. Let's take Tim. Tim from Beaverton, Oregon. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a few simple comments. Initially, this gal that you just talked to, all she needs to do is go register to vote as a Democrat. Simple as that. That's number one. Number two, this insanity with Trump and Russia, it's very simple. He's a complete political imbecile, just like his daughter and his son-in-law. There's no doubt they colluded with Russia. And what they told him when they met with him in the campaign, they said, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to help you get elected, and then we need this from you. And that's why he's in Putin's back pocket. Simple as that. They try to make this complicated nonsense out of basically a two-bit con man who has his finger on the nuclear trigger. It's scary stuff, you know. And all this controversy about the terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and ISIS, they're benevolent organizations compared to the NRA, Fox News, and the Republican hierarchy, because what they're doing is generationally destructive. It's simple as that, you know. And a simple solution to all this, if they want to get things done for the Republicans, take every registered Republican and just remove them from the rolls. Take the government completely out of their life. That's what they want, isn't it? Eliminate Medicare, Medicaid, social programs, and then they'll be happy, right? Does that about cover it?
I think that the challenge, and I'll connect these two things a little bit. First, I'll agree, and then I'll quibble. Part of the challenge of the modern right wing, and why I started with Eric Hoffer and how movements can degrade, is that I think at this point, so much of what defines the right wing is owning the libs. So much of the modern conservative movement is in fact oppositional and trolling, and trying to knock something down, even when that thing isn't really in control. Even when Republicans controlled every branch of government, they went 4 for 4. Now they're 3 for 4, still treating themselves as the aggrieved party, and then spending most of their energy not on a policy program, but spending most of their energy on trying to attack the left. And this is, I think, part of the challenge where we are. So you say, well, they'll be happy if the if finally all these things are eviscerated. I know your tongue was in your cheek when you said it.
Yeah, of course.
But my response is, the purpose is not happiness. The purpose is not an objective. When they are wishing to their genie, they are wishing for more wishes, and ultimately their wish is to be part of this mass movement, and this mass movement's purpose includes, and in fact almost is primarily, about defeating something they call liberal. And that, I think, is critical. And you said something else, though, I want to quibble with, and it's like, well, Carrie's thought was, well, it's Women's History Month. Let's make sure. What are we thinking? What are we doing now? What should we be doing differently so we don't just repeat all of the same stuff we've been doing? And I think that there is that if we too quickly say that, let's just, all we got to do, I think you said, well, elect Democrats. Well, for lots of things, that can be decisive. If we are going to defeat misogyny, it's not enough. We got to defeat that one with ourselves, and I say that very much myself.
A very simple solution is, if Hillary Clinton was in office right now, or Bernie Sanders compared to Trump, this nightmare that's been the last 2 years in this country wouldn't have even nearly existed. Oh no,
I hear that, but I don't think that destroys and defeats and ends rape culture. I don't think that.
You have to start somewhere. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And we've got millennials who won't go out and vote. 17 to 22% of them do that.
Yeah.
The simple key to American politics, I call it the 3 C's: cash, campaigns, and careers. Everything else is secondary, and that even includes the Democratic Party to a certain degree. If they can do anything that actually helps create legislation that helps people, that's their legacy.
I hear that. And what I'll say is, where do we start? I say, yeah, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. That was our day on Tuesday. My thought is, yeah, we need to start with democracy, but we also got to start in our own souls. We got to start in our own lives. We got to start with how we treat people. We got to start with how we interrupt people. We got to start with the movies we saw when we were kids that taught us how to interact with women, and said that what the cool kid does is continue to badger the woman until she says yes. That was toxic for women and toxic for overall human culture, and that we recognize that if we're going to have a more nurturing culture, that's not only about not abusing women, but not abusing anybody, and having a different understanding of how we interact with one another. And I don't say this from an ironclad house, right? My glass house owns nary a stone. I also offer pretend no expertise, but I do want to make sure we have space both for critical political change and also for cultural change. And sometimes it can be led by policy, but also needs to be led by norms, by changing within ourselves. So yeah, let's start with politics, but let's also start with our own souls. Omar from Herndon, you got about 30 seconds.
Well, what I wanted to say is that we can start with the family. You know, every parent has to raise their kids the right way, to respect women and respect everybody. That's what I wanted to say. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about, where do we go from here since we cannot see the Mueller report? Is it through Congress or through the ballot in 2020? Just wanted to get your perspective.
Thank you, Omar. What I'll say is I don't think it's an or. I don't believe that investigations are the primary way to win the hearts and minds of the American people, or to win a policy program, or to make people's lives better. You do investigations so you can understand what actually happened, so you can make sure you have a system of law that works, you hold people accountable, so you make sure if the rot within the White House is as deep as is feared, that you can root some of that out. And, not or, and you got to work at the ballot. And you got to work for 2020. And you got to work at the local level. But I'll add another one. And you got to build more systemic change. You got to make wishes that help you get more wishes. You got to work for democracy, not only for Democrats. We'll be back. This is Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I am Jeff. It's Friday, the end of spring break, 202-808-9925.
Our book for the book report today is Taking Bullets, Terrorism and Black Life in 21st Century America, Confronting White Nationalism, Supremacy, Privilege, Plutocracy, and Oligarchy, A Poet's Representation and Challenge by Haki R. Madhubuti. He writes, this is from the chapter, page 27, the chapter Terror in the Midst of Prayer and Empire. In our perpetual state of national mourning, where our eyes are watered out and our hearts cease to heal at the rate the Creator meant them to, we hold hands in profound silence as we remember the Mother Emanuel 9 of Charleston, South Carolina, those 9 mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers. Even before burying, before black earth covered their caskets, too many ministers, media pundits, and plain white and black folks downgraded the terror that quickened their deaths of our finest in this land to the mental illness and race hatred, in quotes, of a single young white man. He may have acted alone, but he was not alone in his thinking, encouragement, gathering of arms, warped consciousness, confirmation, or ahistorical views, and yeses from the millions in the nation who proudly wear and display the Confederate flag above their hearts and fly it in all of its traitorous glory over a state capitol and other institutions. Again, we find ourselves at war with history and culture, entertaining another call for a national conversation on race and a president weary of trying to make sense of and comfort the grief-stricken nation with words from the highest office of the land. This was written while Obama was president. These are the facts, not an opinion or the ignorant ranting of compromised preachers and television pundits. A 21-year-old white man, a citizen of South Carolina, walked into the sacred and spiritual home of the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church of Charleston, the historic home of black liberation fighter Denmark Vesey, and fatally killed 9 of its members, including the pastor, during Bible study. This was a pure act of domestic terrorism. A modern-day lynching by a young white nationalist who coolly and calmly assassinated 9 black members of Mother Emanuel. Domestic violence and acts of terrorism are on the rise in the United States, as detailed by Charles Kurzman and Daniel Schanzer in their New York Times op-ed, The Other Threat, where they state that, quote, the main terrorist threat in the United States is not from violent Muslim extremists, but from right-wing extremists, end quote. In their national research, local police agencies across the country identified, quote, the militias, neo-Nazis, and sovereign citizens as the major threat the nation faces in regard to extremism, end quote. All of this is homegrown with international connections. Morris Dees and J. Richard Cohen of the Southern Poverty Law Center also writes in the New York Times article, Racists Without Borders, that, quote, Americans tend to view attacks like the mass murder in Charleston as isolated hate crimes, the work of a deranged racist or a group of zealots lashing out in anger unconnected to a broader movement. This view we can no longer afford to indulge. When, according to survivors, Mr. Roof told the victims at the prayer meeting that black people were, quote, taking over the country, he was expressing sentiments that unite white nationalists from the United States and Canada to Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Unlike those of the civil rights era, whose main goal was to maintain Jim Crow in the American South, today's white supremacists don't see borders. They see a white tribe under attack by people of color across the globe. The end of white rule in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and South Africa, they believe, foreshadowed an apocalyptic future for all white people, a white genocide that must be stopped before it's too late. End of quote. The internationalization of terrorism is not a foreign theory in today's social media world. Dees and Cohen will be speaking at a conference in Budapest about this transnational white supremacism that is emerging as the world grows more connected technologically. The message of white genocide is spreading. Also, David J. Whitaker's Terrorism, Understanding the Global Threat, gives another view. Clearly, our rush to forgive this mass murderer within 96 hours of this supreme tragedy is misguided, anti-human, and does not allow for properly grieving the fallen. As perfectly scripted, displaying the permanent effectiveness of Christian acculturation on the Sunday, June 21st, 2015 morning services of Mother Emanuel Church, the black Christians out-Christianed their white brothers and sisters. Before the morning sermon, the presiding elder, Reverend Norvell Goff Sr., found it necessary to thank the local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies for doing their job. He also stated, quote, a lot of folks expected us to do something strange and break out in a riot. Well, they just don't know us. We are people of faith, end quote. I find this statement inappropriate, insensitive, and ahistorical, implying whether he meant it or not, that the recent uprising and rebellions in Ferguson, New York, Cleveland, and other parts of the nation were riots and did not include black people of faith, and that somehow they were strange in their social, political, and economic activism. Informed people do not riot against injustice or white terrorism. They study, organize, and strategically struggle at all levels, in the streets, on the campus, in front of the White House, and in corporate boardrooms. Dylan Roof his stated intentions were to start a race war, and informed black leadership understands that we cannot pray this away or appeal to any law enforcement agency that all across the country, including Charleston, has been seriously compromised. To label black reaction to murder, terrorism, deep unemployment, substandard housing, etc., as riot is to blame the victim.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hello, everybody. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jefferson Smith sitting again. It is Anything Goes Friday. Watch your language. During the break, somebody said, neoliberal. I want to make the case that neoliberal is a dumb word. When I say watch your language, let me be clear what I mean. I want to give an acknowledgement to Frank Luntz, who's one of the best, most notable language manipulators. He said war on terror. A war on terror never has to end. It's not a war on a particular place. Tax relief assumes it's a burden. Starting to say Democrat Party instead of Democratic Party. Partial birth abortion instead of late-term abortion. Death tax. Climate change instead of climate catastrophe. We got to watch our language. Here's my challenge with neoliberal. I'll be giving some others today under the header of watch your language. My challenge with neoliberal, and to give it has been a term on the rise. I think maybe in part on the rise because of Russian bots. I think partly on the rise because of some misleading blogs. Partly on the rise because of a genuine, real concern. And why I think it's dumb, it is used to describe, is because it's misleading. There is another N-word that means miserly. It does not have racist roots, but I don't use that word because it can be confused with the most derided racial slur. Instead of neoliberal, I use market fundamentalist. The Peeler and Society, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, James Buchanan, influencing policymakers like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Alan Greenspan. The word neoliberalism got started getting more purchase among Spanish-speaking scholars and then diffused into the English language study of political economy. The effort to get the left to bash the word neoliberal, to define Hayek as neoliberal, and then say anybody who is for Hayek stuff is neoliberal and then neoliberal is bad and so they are bad. I don't love it. And not because I want to say good things about Hayek or Milton Friedman or James Buchanan. But when people are asked in polls if they're liberal or conservative, I think we want the liberal number to be bigger rather than smaller. We might want, therefore, different words. We can lobby the pollsters. We don't want the word, though, that's supposed to mean the coalition other than conservatives to be a confusingly toxic word, any more than we'd want neo-progressive to mean racist and ethnocentric. I don't, in some respect, care that much about words, except for it's how we communicate and ultimately how we organize our brains. And therefore, when we want to criticize someone who we would define or how somebody, because here's the other part of why it's confusing, is that neoliberalism has also been used to define the ideology formed in the United States more in the 1970s. According to David Brooks, the prominent neoliberal politicians included Al Gore and Bill Clinton of the Democratic Party, included the people who weren't trying to eviscerate all taxes, all public services, all regulations, but were just sort of the center left. And therefore, you can get into a weird, tricky word game where you say, Bill Clinton is the same thing as Hayek. Bill Clinton is not the same thing as Hayek. Yeah, they'd agree on some things that some of us might strongly disagree upon, but they are still vastly different, and vastly different from Milton Friedman. It is a confusing word. The godfather of that version of neoliberalism was the journalist Charles Peters, who in 1983 published a Neoliberals Manifesto. And by the way, the Neoliberals Manifesto was not the same thing as Hayek or Milton Friedman. It was not the same thing as Adam Smith. So, for today's Watch Your Language, market fundamentalist. The person who thinks that all we have to do is reward the powerful at the expense of the powerless and everything else will just work out. That the only kind of freedom that is needed is not freedom for human beings, is not freedom of thought, is not freedom of speech, but is freedom of purchased speech, of purchased thought, the freedom of capital to control, the freedom of money to do anything it wants to accrete, to consolidate, and to eviscerate any limitation that might in fact support human freedom. I don't know if that's neo. It's not that neo. John C. Calhoun was making the same argument 200 years ago. And it is one definition of liberal, but not the common definition of liberal that most people, that most human beings use. So I don't need to die on this hill. But I do think it's easier and a little more accurate, a little more helpful rhetorically to say market fundamentalist. Some other ones that I like. Not accident, but crash. Not just climate change, but climate fires and climate floods and climate catastrophe. Not just a broad swath of free speech, but differentiating purchase speech. Got that, by the way, from a Thom Hartmann caller about 3 years ago when I was listening to the Thom Hartmann show. I said, that's brilliant. When we're talking about purchase speech, let's say it's purchase speech. That's different than free speech. It wasn't free, it cost money. Another one is differentiating special interests to differentiate private interest and public interest. The oil lobbyist is different from the group of parents who are advocating to do something about gun violence, to do something about education. Those are vastly different things. Advocating for the consolidated self-interest is different than advocating for the broader public interest. Not just income inequality, but wealth inequality. Forgive me if this piece is being a little bit pedantic, but after reading Don't Think of an Elephant, watching Frank Luntz and actually meeting the guy, and then tracking this stuff for 10 years, I keep this little list of how do we watch for Orwellian language, how do we watch for framed language. When somebody says death tax, no, no, no. No such thing as a death tax. All of us are taxed 100% at death. You can't take it with you. Estate tax, inheritance tax, rich kids tax, all accurate. Death tax, not accurate. If you have your own Watch Your Language, have your own better way to make sure that we have some common way of communicating, which ends up mattering in policymaking, ends up mattering in the debate, you can call in 202-808-9925. Let's take a quick call from Damon from Las Vegas. Go ahead, Damon.
Yeah, I just want to, I hear about socialism all the time, and I just wanted to talk about it for a second.
Go ahead.
I hope you give me a second to talk. So there was a socialist, and he had 100% housing. He had no poverty. He owned a lot of gold and a lot of silver. And he made sure that every person in his entire country got a percentage of his oil revenue. When a child was born, he gave $5,000 to the mother. And when a couple got married, he gave $50,000 for their first house. This is socialism. This is what we fear. When he died, he was worth $300 billion. Do you know what I'm talking about?
$300 billion?
He was the fourth richest man of all time.
There hasn't been anybody yet worth $300 billion. If you take Rockefeller and project his wealth to now.
No. You can Google it. He was worth $300 billion.
Who? No, I don't know who you're talking about.
Okay. When he died, he was worth $300 billion.
Who was it?
Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi.
And so your point is, we should fear socialism because of Gaddafi, or we shouldn't fear socialism? And you're right. I was limiting myself only to America. I wasn't thinking about head of nation states.
Yeah, I know, and I'm just saying. No, I'm saying my point is, he had 100%, 100% of people in this country had a place to live. 100% of the people in this country paid no electricity. 100% of this country had clean water. 100% of this country got a stipend from his oil reserves. He had 2 or 3 tons.
Pose your question, Damon. I appreciate the call. I'm wanting to understand the question.
Oh, no, there's no question. I'm saying that we get told about how socialism is going to be the end of all society, but this man, Gaddafi, and I keep saying his name, had 100% socialism. And do you know when he died, he had 98% approval rating?
Yeah. So Damon, I appreciate it. We're gonna go to the next call. The way that when the call came through, the question that was framed was, why do people think of socialism as a bad thing? If you're trying to promote socialism being a good thing, I don't know that Gaddafi is the example. I'll give a response on one of the challenges with socialism as a word, and that is, I think in part, it's a victim of its own success. That it was 100 years ago, almost exactly 100 years ago, started to be 85 years ago, the most popular sort of ideological set of programs in the world. So much so that opposite ends of the spectrum co-opted the word. Communists, Nazis all started using the word. We're that. We're probably democratic also, because that was also a popular word. And that they end up poisoning those words with totalitarianism. And I think that's part of the challenge we're in now. We've got just a quick thing. Jim, you got about 30 seconds, Sacramento, California.
Yeah, along those lines, language and everything, good neighbor policy, 1920s, was an actual stand-up against the communists and was overturned by Nixon, and that's why he got stoned when he got out of the limo. It's just that simple. Good neighborship.
Appreciate it, Jim. We'll be right back. This is the Thom Hartmann Show, 202-808-9925. Anything Goes Friday.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And it really is Anything Goes Friday, 202-808-9925. Cliff from Canyon Country, California. Go ahead, Cliff.
Good morning, Jefferson. I think you do an excellent job filling in for Tom.
Thanks, Cliff.
Absolutely. I think it was last Friday. I stopped by a local Thai restaurant in my neighborhood, ordered some takeout. So I sit down in a table, 2 gentlemen next to me speaking a foreign language. It wasn't Thai, it wasn't Spanish. It was maybe Armenian or some Eastern European language. Anyways, across the room, there's an Asian couple having lunch. I probably was outnumbered being a Caucasian at this restaurant. And as these guys are conversing, I'm thinking to myself, man, congratulations. Excellent on you getting to America and starting a life here. I thought, I really admire anybody that can do this. And I'm having a beer. The guy next to me is having a beer. They're eating lunch. And I'm thinking, they pay the same amount of money for their food that I do. They're paying the same sales tax that I do. I'm just thinking, what's the problem? I don't get it. I never thought to myself, get out of my country.
Yeah.
I just don't understand the hate and ignorance and xenophobia that is so pervasive in this country right now.
Do you not understand? Is it truly that you don't understand any of it, or you're just strongly opposed to it, or a little of both?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I just don't. I don't get where this ignorance comes from. I imagine, you're a product of your upbringing. If you're raised in a racist, family, you're going to generally come out as a racist. But my experience is most people I deal with, I don't see racism. I see most people just doing their thing in life, trying to make it. but I don't understand this intense hatred and ignorance of people just because they're not speaking English or they're not from America.
Yeah,
I just don't get it.
Yeah, no, I'll hear it, and I'll even respond. At some level, I don't either. Nor do I want to stand in the shoes of sort of standing up for it. But I do want to say this. I understand parts of it because I think it's in all of us. I think ethnocentrism is at risk in every culture and every race and every human being. I think being a jerk, I think extreme tribalism is within all of us. And I think in dominant Western culture, misogyny and racism is in all of us, and often it's most pernicious and we don't recognize it. And we think that the only definition of racism and misogyny is if we, don't hire someone because we are cognizant of, we consciously don't, because we're consciously aware of our differences and therefore we make sort of a choice that way. Or we don't think we're racist because we don't use racial slurs, not recognizing that we have an entire power structure that has been to the advantage of a smaller sector of our people and to the disadvantage of huge sectors of our people. And as soon as I think about that, then I'm like, okay, well, then I sort of understand. I don't want to empathize, or at least I don't want to agree, but some portions of it I understand. And that understanding, I think, can be useful if we want to try to have a little bit more egalitarian world. And part of it is acknowledging that it's not just over there. The darkness that the misogyny, that racism, ethnocentrism, that jingoism, that xenophobia isn't just in that other person. And if we just elected a different political party, everything would be fine. I think we've got to do a lot more than that. We've got a long way to go, I think. We'll be back. We are back. I'm Jeff Smith. It's Anything Goes Friday. Call in number 202-808-9925. Phones lighting up today. It's the last day of spring break. People want to get their piece in. I want to go to Paul from WCPT, Ain't Afraid of Me, saying that words matter in Arroyo Hondo. Hello, sir. Paul, you there? Paul is moving, is cleaning his garage. Paul,
no, I'm right here.
Oh, Paul, hello, sir.
Hey, sorry. Jeff, my simple binary is simply corporatists versus populists. And it actually, unfortunately, swallows up quite a bit of Democrats, too. But that's unfortunately where we're at.
And your definition, I think I understand your definition of corporatist, and what's your definition of populist?
Well, quite simply, just policies for people.
Yeah.
They're for populist people.
Yeah.
I think Bernie's a populist. I think there's a lot of populists out there, or no, there's not a lot, unfortunately, but they're advocating for the people.
Yeah. And something that David Sirota said, in fact, he said it to me years ago, was that the best program is a progressive populist program. That's ultimately what progressives need to do, is be more populist. The challenge I'm having with the word populist right now, and it's not I don't have a position, I just have curiosity, is that it is also too often used to differentiate Donald Trump from Paul Ryan. And I think it is a misunderstanding of the term. I think what the members of the media mean is a little bit elitist, which is a little bit like, oh, it's the dumb, rude stuff, rather than the sort of the smart market fundamentalist stuff. And I think that's also a pretty false frame. But if somebody has a better word than populist to define that isn't just so charged to seem so obviously a partisan chosen word to describe the Trump phenomenon, the difference between the MAGA hat wearer and the Paul Ryan supporter, I would welcome that word. But Paul, appreciate it.
Yeah. You know what it would be?
Yeah.
Just simply say not corporatists.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, within that corporatist frame, actually, it's an easy shift right into fascism, because that's the definition of fascism.
No, in fact, one could even say, depending on how we use the words, and again, I appreciate sort of your thesis statement that words matter, and do want to get to the next call, but one way of understanding fascism is corporate populism, is taking the concentrated wealth and developing a set of messages that will hasn't yet been a majority. Trump gets to his, 40%, 42%. Hitler got to his 30-something percent. But to get a meaningful piece, sufficient to be described as a mass movement, behind a market fundamentalism, authoritarian regime. I just don't like giving populism that kind of credit, in part because what you just said is you want to use that word. Progressive populism is one. I don't have the answer on that one. Maybe somebody else does. Let me go to Mark, who's listening to us on XM from Oakland, California. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing great. Thank you. And the reason I was calling is that I was listening to your conversation about Frank Luntz on the radio.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say that I'm a little bit disappointed in the fact that the Democrats haven't picked up on, over the past 10 years, that language matters, and that they haven't hired their own Frank Luntz. And I'm going to give you a specific example. When Trump passed the tax, and the Republican-controlled Congress passed that tax cut in 2017, it wasn't a tax cut. It was a cash advance on the federal credit card to be redistributed to the wealthiest 1% of American families.
Oh, that's a good one.
And not once have I heard a Democrat refer to that as a cash advance.
I'd never heard it said by anybody, not a Democrat or anybody.
But am I right?
I think it's a really interesting idea, because so first of all, amen that words matter, and amen also that it's been hard to find within too many of the consultant realm people who have been wordsmiths in this way. There have been some. I think even Barack Obama in some respects had genius elements of language, but we haven't yet built all the rhetorical architecture we need to have a more egalitarian economy and a better working democracy. I think we can do some of that from the bottom up. That's why I'm dwelling on it some today, so that folks like you, so that folks like us, when we attend a house party of a politician and they use a particular word, we can say, hey, you should use this one instead. Not to be word police and embarrass them in front of everybody, but to be mini educators, to be mini helpers. That if we start using this in our own emails, in our own social media posts, and our own phone calls on the radio, that we can start impacting the language the same way, I hope a more benevolent way, that has been done. And I'll give you one of the reasons why Luntz was better. It's not that all of his clients, most of his clients even, were people in politics. They were businesses who needed to figure out that hassle-free was a really useful word if you wanted to sell some home product. And so they built this. So this was corporate language expertise, then translating into the sphere of politics and democracy. And so it's not that surprising that the activist world that has sort of a smaller budget, that's just trying to figure out how do you get people to my rally? How do I get some politician to listen? How do I read this policy paper and translate it into action? Doesn't have every Madison Avenue firm doing wordsmithing for them. That's one of the reasons why I've started this document where I keep track, call it Watch Your Language, for people who love and fear words, why I am tracking these things to collect them. And I just added your cash advance rather than tax cut when we're talking about a tax cut to the wealthy, because you're right, I say tax cut to the wealthy all the time. And for some people, well, tax cut's good, wealthy, maybe that's good. I don't know, that sounds not so bad. So I appreciate it, Mark.
Let me make a last point, because this is the point. This is the key point to what I'm going to try to get at right here. So when you take out a cash advance for $1.5 trillion on your credit card and you redistribute it to the wealthiest American families, what's another word for that? Socialism. So when I would urge your callers, and I'm going to just call Alexandria Ocasio, their office today, because she's having a town hall with Chris Hayes on television, national television. And when they're going to try to attack her for being a democratic socialist and make socialism a bad word, she should say, let me tell you what the real definition of socialism.
Yeah.
Taking out a $1.5 trillion cash advance on the U.S. taxpayer's credit card and giving it to the wealthiest Americans. Yeah. That's socialism.
Appreciate it, Mark.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Call-in number is 202-808-9925. Anything Goes Friday. Also talking about Watch Your Language and a little bit about understanding the right wing.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Say fight back!
Hey, over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's there's just it's there. It's there for you. And it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff. And you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great. Our book for the book report today is Taking Bullets, Terrorism and Black Life in 21st Century America, Confronting White Nationalism, Supremacy, Privilege, Plutocracy, and Oligarchy, a Poet's Representation and Challenge by Haki R. Madhubuti. He writes, this is from the chapter, page 27, the chapter Terror in the Midst of Prayer and Empire. In our perpetual state of national mourning, where our eyes are watered out and our hearts cease to heal at the rate the Creator meant them to, we hold hands in profound silence as we remember the Mother Emanuel 9 of Charleston, South Carolina, those 9 mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers. Even before burying, before black earth covered their caskets, too many ministers, media pundits, and plain white and black folks downgraded the terror that quickened their deaths of our finest in this land to the mental illness and race hatred, in quotes, of a single young white man. He may have acted alone, but he was not alone in his thinking, encouragement, gathering of arms, warped consciousness, confirmation, or ahistorical views, and yeses from the millions in the nation who proudly wear and display the Confederate flag above their hearts and fly it in all of its traitorous glory over a state capitol and other institutions. Again, we find ourselves at war with history and culture, entertaining another call for a national conversation on race and a president weary of trying to make sense of and comfort the grief-stricken nation with words from the highest office of the land. This was written while Obama was president. These are the facts, not an opinion or the ignorant ranting of compromised preachers and television pundits. A 21-year-old white man, a citizen of South Carolina, walked into the sacred and spiritual home of the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church of Charleston, the historic home of black liberation fighter Denmark Vesey, and fatally killed 9 of its members, including the pastor, during Bible study. This was a pure act of domestic terrorism. A modern-day lynching by a young white nationalist who coolly and calmly assassinated 9 black members of Mother Emanuel. Domestic violence and acts of terrorism are on the rise in the United States, as detailed by Charles Kurzman and Daniel Schanzer in their New York Times op-ed, The Other Threat, where they state that, quote, the main terrorist threat in the United States is not from violent Muslim extremists, but from right-wing extremists, end quote. In their national research, local police agencies across the country identified, quote, the militias, neo-Nazis, and sovereign citizens as the major threat the nation faces in regard to extremism, end quote. All of this is homegrown with international connections. Morris Dees and J. Richard Cohen of the Southern Poverty Law Center also writes in the New York Times article, Racists Without Borders, that, quote, Americans tend to view attacks like the mass murder in Charleston as isolated hate crimes, the work of a deranged racist or a group of zealots lashing out in anger unconnected to a broader movement. This view we can no longer afford to indulge. When, according to survivors, Mr. Roof told the victims at the prayer meeting that black people were, quote, taking over the country, he was expressing sentiments that unite white nationalists from the United States and Canada to Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Unlike those of the civil rights era, whose main goal was to maintain Jim Crow in the American South, today's white supremacists don't see borders. They see a white tribe under attack by people of color across the globe. The end of white rule in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and South Africa, they believe, foreshadowed an apocalyptic future for all white people, a white genocide that must be stopped before it's too late. End of quote. The internationalization of terrorism is not a foreign theory in today's social media world. Dees and Cohen will be speaking at a conference in Budapest about this transnational white supremacism that is emerging as the world grows more connected technologically. The message of white genocide is spreading. Also, David J. Whitaker's Terrorism, Understanding the Global Threat, gives another view. Clearly, our rush to forgive this mass murderer within 96 hours of this supreme tragedy is misguided, anti-human, and does not allow for properly grieving the fallen. As perfectly scripted, displaying the permanent effectiveness of Christian acculturation on the Sunday, June 21st, 2015 morning services at Mother Emanuel Church, the black Christians out-Christianed their white brothers and sisters. Before the morning sermon, the presiding elder, Reverend Norvell Goff Sr., found it necessary to thank the local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies for doing their job. He also stated, quote, "A lot of folks expected us to do something strange and break out in a riot. Well, they just don't know us. We are people of faith," end quote. I find this statement inappropriate, insensitive, and ahistorical, implying, whether he meant it or not, that the recent uprising and rebellions in Ferguson, New York, Cleveland, and other parts of the nation were riots and did not include black people of faith, and that somehow they were strange in their social, political, and economic activism. Informed people do not riot against injustice or white terrorism. They study, organize, and strategically struggle at all levels, in the streets, on the campus, in front of the White House, and in corporate boardrooms. Dylan Roof stated his stated intentions were to start a race war, and informed black leadership understands that we cannot pray this away or appeal to any law enforcement agency that all across the country, including Charleston, has been seriously compromised. To label black reaction to murder, terrorism, deep unemployment, substandard housing, etc., as riot is to blame the victim.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Got a note in. Wanted to honor Agnes Varda, the filmmaker, the activist. End of Women's History Month. Shout out to Agnes Varda. Also got a note, one way that we can help is to re-champion the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which Phyllis Schlafly helped to kill some decades ago. Appreciate people's notes. By the way, you can tweet at us at Thom Hartmann or at me at Jefferson D. Smith. Got one, it's disheartening that we now have a choice, truth, justice, or the American way. When I opened the show, I said that every great cause begins as a movement, becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. That's Eric Hoffer's line. I don't entirely agree, but I do think that the origin and arguable degeneration of the right-wing movement, of the conservative movement, of the free market, or just, let's say, the market fundamentalist movement, is an interesting and important topic, and one that gets vastly too little attention. When you think about it, these folks have now risen to such prominence, they control much of the country, control much of the world, and how many people can actually name the philosophical underpinnings, the leaders of right-wing history, and really understand and connect those dots? Whether one is an activist or a partisan or merely just a historian, This stuff is really important and really interesting. Want to bring on now our guest, Seth Kotler, professor of history. Going to talk to us about it. Has been doing a bunch of research on the history of the conservative movement. Seth, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Should I call you Doctor or Seth? Mr. Kotler, the Honorable? How would you like to be referred?
His Excellency would be great. No,
all right.
Just Seth is fine.
So, Seth, explain your area of research and how you got into this mess.
So I'm trained as a historian of 18th and 19th century America. My first book was on actually radicalism in the late 18th century. It was about Tom Paine and the Americans who loved him in the era of the French Revolution. But then that got me interested in conservatism because the 1790s is also the birth of what we think of as modern conservatism, with the writings of Edmund Burke writing against the French Revolution. And so out of that, I started getting interested in conservatism, and I'm teaching at a liberal arts college in Oregon with largely progressive students. And around the time of the Tea Party in 2010, I started to get kind of dismayed by the way my students understood what conservatism was, that they tended to think of it as a deficit, as ignorance. And even though I myself don't identify as a conservative, I was like, I thought, this isn't really very useful for you to just think of conservatism and equate it with ignorance. You should understand this political tradition before you reject it, or if you want to actually work against it in any meaningful way. So I started teaching a course on the history of American conservatism starting in 2010. So, and I've been doing it every year, every other year since then. So needless to say, things have evolved a bit in terms of how historians think about the history of conservatism since, the second year of Barack Obama's presidency.
And how do you think the understanding, the definition of conservatism has changed in the minds of most Americans?
So I think that's a long story.
No, I know. We're not going to be able to do the whole course in the next few minutes, but please just talk very, very fast and write your entire course on a couple grains of rice.
Exactly. So basically, in 2016, when I was teaching the course, a lot of what we were reading, the way the students were responding to what we were reading was, well, gosh, what Donald Trump is saying, he doesn't sound like a conservative in any really meaningful way. He doesn't seem to embrace these things. He surely doesn't sound like Edmund Burke. He surely doesn't sound like a free market fundamentalist with all of his talk of tariffs and so on and so forth. And many folks in the class, and we were reading, for example, the National Review, which put out an entire edition devoted to the idea that Donald Trump is not a conservative. Mm-hmm. And so, but then he won. And now when you look at the polls, and people who identify themselves as conservative overwhelmingly support Donald Trump and admire Donald Trump.
And there's so much to untangle. There's so much to untangle because part of what I would say that when David Frum and others were saying this dude isn't a conservative was part because what he was saying about trade, what he was saying about Social Security and Medicare, what he was saying about campaign finance reform, and he was just lying. Like he didn't do it, with the exception of trade, like the stuff that fell most squarely out of the conservative tradition, he just didn't do. He just said in order to try to get working class votes in Pennsylvania.
Exactly. Yeah, and so he's governed basically like a standard Republican, tax cuts and deregulation. So there really hasn't been anything discernible that he's actually done as a policymaker that is, other than perhaps his extreme saber rattling around immigration, that there was mixed feelings amongst Republicans in the 2000s and aughts about immigration reform, and there's a long history of that. So he's more extreme on the immigration issue than standard issue Republicans would have been in the 2000s or early 2010s. But aside from that, he's basically governed in the way that one would expect Mitt Romney to govern, or in terms of the actual policy, which is why Ben Sass and Jeff Flake and Susan Collins, regardless of all of their statements of disappointment, if you look at their voting record, they vote 95% with Donald Trump.
Yep.
So that it's that discrepancy between his sort of authoritarian persona and the kind of cult of personality that he has very consciously cultivated, and the extreme attacks on the press the extreme attacks on the basic norms and values of law and order and political procedures that really make him distinct from what we would think of as like a John McCain or a Mitt Romney. But this is where he invokes, to a historian like me, other historical precedents like Father Coughlin from the 1930s, a demagogic radio preacher who was a fascist and kind of sympathetic to the Nazis, but also a populist. Donald Trump also invokes Pat Buchanan. If you think about the 1992 speech that Pat Buchanan gave at the GOP convention, I remember at the time, I was like in my early 20s, and my favorite line about that was by Molly Ivins, the political journalist from Texas, who said, you know, apparently the speech was it was much better in the original German.
I remember. And I've even heard it argued that the victory of Donald Trump over the younger Bush was like the youngest Bush, of that generation at least, was a bit akin to Buchanan having beaten the elder Bush.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I think in the 90s, for many folks, they saw Buchanan as a dinosaur, you know, that he was just this weird leftover from the past that kind of lived inside the Republican Party as this kind of dying vestigial thread. And it turns out that Pat Buchanan was actually the future of the party. Right? It took a while.
Yeah, but it's fascinating. And let me ask this, because they're about to cut us off.
Okay.
There is a debate that has raged. It hasn't raged enough, actually, but it is out there whether Donald Trump is a departure from the conservative tradition, or in fact it's apotheosis, or in fact it's sort of at furthest away, it's Frankenstein's monster. How would you characterize it? Do you consider Trump an outgrowth of the conservative movement, or in some important way a departure?
Yes, I think he is an outgrowth of that movement. So that movement was always very complicated and fractured, right? So I think whenever Trump conservatives say that they revile him and don't see him as one of their own, I think they're speaking in good faith when they say that. I also think that they were a bit naive in not seeing the Trumpist elements within
Seth Kotler, and we'll be right back. This is Tom Shaw. I'm Jeff.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with your calls right after this. 202-808-9925. Anything Goes Friday, plus watch your language and the history of the right wing. We're back with Seth Kotler, who teaches a course on the history of the conservative movement. Seth, let me ask this. What would surprise people the most, you think, or what would surprise the most people, at least a little bit, when it comes to the history and genesis and evolution of the conservative movement? Or if that's too hard a question, what do you think is most important for people to know? If somebody said, listen, Doc, I'm not sticking around to take the course, I just wanted your best sentence, what would that be? What's the most important thing people need to know?
So I think an important thing that people need to know is the way in which theoretically kind of gender and racialized neutral language of freedom has been used as a kind of dog whistle to justify various conservative positions. Let me make that more clear. So there's a great book called White Flight about Atlanta in the 1960s. And part of his argument is that when a whole bunch of white people fled Atlanta to flee desegregating schools, to flee integrating workplaces, they did so in the name of freedom. They were like, I want to live in a community with people like me, and I don't want to pay all these taxes. I want to live a life of freedom. None of that is about racism. But what was driving them out was black people moving into their neighborhoods, black people coming into their schools, black people swimming in their public pools. So white people in 1940s and 50s Atlanta loved public pools. They went to them all the time. Nobody had a private pool. And then in the 1960s, suddenly people discovered the joys of having a pool in your own backyard in the suburbs. And that is not unconnected to the history of the civil rights movement and the history of integration. So that when we hear people use the kind of neutral language of freedom, opposition to taxation, opposition to public goods like public transportation, et cetera. Behind that often is a coded kind of language of racial backlash.
Oh, it's such an important point.
And I think people often don't see it. You know, so in other words, the people who say that can say, I think, in good faith to themselves, like, "Oh, I'm not racist. You know, I have a black friend at work."
Have you read? A favorite book around here is Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains. Have you read it?
I have, and in fact, she was a professor of mine in graduate school.
Okay, all right. So you come by it honestly, and so the two things that occur to me are one that where that book shook me was connecting when I had sort of thought of the Buchanan thing and the Hayek thing as uneasy allies. Right, sort of like the racist tradition and the market fundamentalist tradition, as well as just what you do to build a coalition that can win, and these aren't real buddies. That her case was no, this stuff was integrally intertwined in the ideological development of the United States of America going back to John C. Calhoun. That rocked me. And then the other one is, whether it's linked tradition or not, the other one is when I see, if I look at someone who's an avowed angry libertarian on their Twitter feed, too often times I look at their feed and I'm like, oh, that's somebody who, if they said they have a black friend, I'm not sure they'd be telling the truth, because I'm not sure you'd be able to get away with saying that stuff in my group of friends. And so maybe that's history. Maybe it's any last thought or a favorite recommendation of something to read?
White Flight by Kevin Cruz. And I'd also say, on the point that you just made, the distinction between conservative intellectuals and the conservative movement is really important, right? So we can read Hayek and von Mises and say that those people aren't writing out of a place of racial backlash.
Yep.
But the movement that evolved around those ideas was very much about that.
Yep.
And that's
we'll be right. I want to say thanks to Seth Kotler and say goodbye less rudely by giving a chance for a last thought. You recommended White Flight by, did you say by Cruz? Is that the Princeton guy?
Kevin Cruz, yeah, he teaches at Princeton. Mm-hmm.
He's doing, I want to talk to him also at some point. He's doing really good stuff, and he connects historical dots on political movements and political ideology really well. The way he came to my attention was because he was willing to go after Dinesh D'Souza for just making stuff up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And another book I would recommend, and this is an older one, but it's really good. It's called Suburban Warriors, The Origins of the New American Right by Lisa McGurr, who is a professor at Harvard. And this is a book about Orange County, about Southern California and the kind of complicated dynamics that explain the rise of Goldwater, Nixon, and Reagan out of that Southern California context. And part of the irony that she develops is the way that this was a place built by federal funding, you know, by the military, by technology. And the irony is that this then became the hotbed of this kind of deeply anti-modern conservative tradition.
Oh, that's interesting. So like Orange County, like where, say again, geographically where you're talking about?
So the book focuses on Orange County. And
yeah. No, that's right. Now, all that, Orange County was in some respects, the birthplace of Reagan's conservatism, and that was all built by military contract money.
Right. And so she teases that out not just as a contradiction, but as a kind of really interesting paradox.
Yeah.
Around where does this sort of conservative political movement come from? And she also centers the role that women played in the kind of growth of a grassroots conservative movement as well.
And the person that's coming to mind is the woman who sold orange juice.
Anita Bryant.
Yeah, that's the person that comes to mind.
Right, and I think for her that was kind of a Florida context, and that was very much in the mid to late 1970s, and this backlash against the gay rights movement, where she kind of partnered with the emerging kind of moral majority, you know, this kind of right-wing fundamentalist movement that was gathering steam in the 70s and into the 80s, that was built a lot around these resentments about gay liberation.
And you said something really important that you say to your students, and it was part of the origin of the course you've been teaching for, I think you said 10 years, which is if we're going to try to understand what's happening in the country, and if we're going to try to make things better, and even if your aim is to oppose what's happening in the country, you've got to understand, it is very helpful to understand the history, the origins, the power structure of the right-wing movement, and really appreciate your time. I wanted to amplify one other point, or have you amplify a point that you had made, again, which is this connection, this maybe subversion or manipulation of the word freedom, or of the idea of freedom, when in fact what it was cloaking, or it was describing, was freedom for white people to be separate from black people.
Right. Yeah. And that, I mean, there's a long history. There's a great book by Edmund Morgan called American Freedom, American Slavery, that was written back in the 1970s, that talked about the paradox that American freedom and American unfreedom have always been kind of inextricably bound up one with another. One of my favorite kind of anecdotes from the Revolutionary era is that Patrick Henry, the guy who said, you know, give me liberty or give me death, was the around the time that he said, give me liberty or give me death, he also passed a resolution clamping down on the freedom of enslaved people in Virginia, because the British were offering enslaved people their freedom if they would fight with the British against the Patriots. And so the guy who said, give me liberty or give me death, said, oh, but by the way, don't give them liberty.
Yeah. Right? Liberty for me, people that look like me, but this concept of liberty, I mean something different by it.
Right, and so which is not not to come from a place of total cynicism that nobody ever means it when they talk about liberty. Like, for example, those enslaved people, when they fled George Washington's plantation, when they fled Thomas Jefferson's plantation, were seeking freedom in the way that was meaningful to them. And so freedom was an incredibly meaningful concept to enslaved people and to many people in that era. It's just that whenever people talk about freedom, it's always enmeshed in these complicated power dynamics.
And this is, I will say, this can get, and if you try to understand the history and the complexity of the right wing, it can be a complex thing and a lot of things to understand. But if I'm going to try to simplify it, I think I'm going to say Your Excellency, Dr. Kotler. But Seth, to me, if I were going to boil it down to a couple things, to me, there is a tension that the big fight is between freedom for human beings and freedom, I would call it power, of property. And even that thread even gets back to your Patrick Henry example, right? Like, I don't want to be taxed by the British, but I still want to be able to hold slaves. It draws Nancy McLean and John C. Calhoun, who was advocating very specifically for the freedom to own human beings. It then connects to the modern sort of Hayek and Milton Friedman idea of, when we say freedom, what we mean is unfettered capital concentrating as much as it wants to, unregulated, untaxed as much as it possibly can be, not really addressing freedom of human beings, freedom for women to have an abortion if they need to, freedom for people to be able to have a decent place to live and a decent place to go to school, or freedom of speech for human beings, not just freedom of purchase speech. That this idea of freedom for human beings, rather than just unfettered capital, is one way. Am I oversimplifying, or how would you disagree or amplify?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. There's a tension between the sort of aspirations of democracy and the aspirations of property. Or capitalism and democracy have a complicated relationship with each other. And this is where, when we go back to the New Deal, and this is why the New Deal is so important. I mean, basically the entire modern conservative movement is built in opposition to the New Deal, with a desire to dismantle the entire kind of liberal order and regulatory apparatus that was built up during the New Deal in order to oversee and regulate capitalism in the interests of people rather than in the interests of property. And so this is why there's a great book by a woman named Kim Phillips Fine called Invisible Hands, which is about the history of the businessman's war against the New Deal, which starts during the New Deal, but then carries forward through the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Would you be willing to do something? We're gonna wrap, and I'm gonna finally keep my promise of getting back to calls. I could nerd out on this stuff for hours, and I hope we will have a chance to talk again. I hugely appreciate your time. Would you do me a favor? And if you've got Twitter, tweet at me. I'm Jefferson D. Smith. Those book links, those book suggestions, and I'll retweet them out. And if the good people of the Thom Hartmann Show want to, maybe they'll do likewise.
All right, excellent. Thank you.
Seth Kotler, thank you so much. Professor, studying the history of the right wing so we can all understand better. We'll be right back.
To the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And it really will be Anything Goes Friday. We really will get to your calls right after this.
Today we're reading from David Blight's book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. This is from the introduction. In his speech at the dedication of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., September 24, 2016, President Barack Obama delivered what he termed a, quote, clear-eyed view of a tragic and triumphant history of black Americans in the United States. He spoke of a history that is central to the larger American story, one that is both contradictory and extraordinary. He likened the African American experience to the infinite depths of Shakespeare and Scripture. The, quote, embrace of truth as best we can know it, said the president, is, quote, where real patriotism lies. Naming some of the major pivots of the country's past, Obama wrapped up his central theme in a remarkable sentence about the Civil War era. Quote, we've buttoned up our Union blues to join the fight for our freedom. We've railed against injustice for decade upon decade, a lifetime of struggle and progress and enlightenment that we see etched in Frederick Douglass's mighty leonine gaze, end quote. How Americans react to Douglass's gaze, indeed how we gaze back at his visage, and more important, how we read him, appropriate him, or engage his legacies, informs how we use our past to determine who we are. Douglass's life and writing emerged from nearly the full scope of the 19th century, representative of the best and the worst in the American spirit. Douglass constantly probed the ironies of America's contradictions over slavery and race. Few Americans use Shakespeare and the Bible to comprehend his story and that of his people as much as Douglass. And there may be no better example of an American radical patriot than the slave who became a lyrical prophet of freedom, natural rights, and human equality. Obama channeled Douglass in his dedication speech, knowingly or not. So do many people today. Born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, a slave, in Talbot County, Maryland, in February 1818, the future Frederick Douglass was the son of Harriet Bailey, one of 5 daughters of Betsy Bailey, and with some likelihood his mother's white owner. He saw his mother for the last time in 1825, though he hardly knew her. She died the following year. Douglass lived 20 years as a slave and nearly 9 years as a fugitive slave subject to recapture. From the 1840s to his death in 1895, he attained international fame as an abolitionist, editor, orator of almost unparalleled signature, and the author of 3 autobiographies that are classics of the genre. As a public man, he began his abolitionist career 2 decades before America would divide and fight a civil war over slavery that he openly welcomed. Douglass was born in a backwater of the slave society of the South, just as steamboats appeared in bays and on American rivers, and before the telegraph, the railroad, and the rotary press changed human mobility and consciousness. He died after the emergence of electric lights, the telephone, and the invention of the phonograph. The renewed orator and traveler loved and used most of these elements of modernity and technology. Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century, explained in this book, and especially by the intrepid research of 3 other scholars I write upon. Although it can never really be measured, he may also have been, along with Mark Twain, the most widely traveled American public figure of his century. By the 1890s, in sheer miles and countless number of speeches, he had few rivals as a lecturer in the golden age of oratory. It is likely that more Americans heard Frederick Douglass speak than any other public figure of his time. Indeed, to see or hear Douglass became a kind of wonder of the American world. He struggled as well with the pleasures and perils of fame as much as anyone else in his century, with the possible exceptions of General Ulysses S. Grant or P.T. Barnum. Douglass's dilemma with fame was a matter of decades, not merely of moments, and fraught with racism. The orator and writer lived to see and interpret black emancipation, to work actively for women's rights long before they were achieved, to realize the civil rights triumphs and tragedies of Reconstruction, and to witness and contribute to America's economic and international expansion in the Gilded Age. He lived to the age of lynching and Jim Crow laws, when America collapsed into retreat from the real victories and revolutions in race relations that he had helped to win. He played a pivotal role in America's second founding out of the apocalypse of the Civil War, and he very much wished to see himself as a founder and defender of the Second American Republic. In one lifetime of anti-slavery, literary, and political activism, Douglass was many things, And the set of apparent paradoxes makes his story so attractive to biographers, as well as to so many constituencies today. He was a radical thinker and a proponent of classic 19th century political liberalism. At different times, he hated and loved his country. He was a ferocious critic of the United States and all its hypocrisies, but also, after emancipation, became a government bureaucrat, a diplomat, and a voice for territorial expansion. He strongly believed in self-reliance and demanded an activist interventionist government at all levels to free slaves, defeat the Confederacy, and to protect black citizens against terror and discrimination. Douglas was a serious constitutional thinker, and few Americans have ever analyzed race with more poignancy and nuance than this mostly self-taught genius with words. He was a radical editor, writer, and activist. The book Frederick Douglass by David Blight.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Howdy, everybody. This is Thom Hartmann Show. It's Friday. It is the end of spring break. It is the end of the stint for this substitute teacher. And we are halfway through the show. We appreciate everybody who has called. Let's get to your calls. In fact, let's do a quick speed round so that we can open the lines for some more wonderful human beings who want to dazzle us with their intelligence. Bob, San Jose on AM 910. Speak your piece, Bob.
Okay, briefly, there's a tsunami coming in the Senate. From what I understand, Mitch McConnell has blown up the rules relating to confirmation of judges, and they're now going to have a confirmation hearing for each judge be only 2 hours. That means the assembly line going to be cranked up, and I think the reason they're doing that is there's a really good possibility of a blue wave coming, and they're trying to pack the courts as much as possible before that happens.
Thank you so much for bringing this up, Bob. It is so critically important. If you do track the history of the right wing, if you do track the Lochner era, if you do track the Koch brothers, if you just look at their spending, so much of the emphasis has been on getting, in fact, just recently, the Koch brothers didn't invest a whole lot in the congressional races, in the House races. How come? Because the most important priority, Nancy McLean and Democracy in Chains makes this point flatly. The top priority is, in fact, the courts, because the courts get the last word. Another thought, and so the right wing has highly prioritized getting the courts. It's one of the reasons they were able to get Donald Trump elected, they were able to get Christian conservatives to take this decidedly unchristian person to be their right-wing Christian champion. And it's one of the reasons why people who care about democracy need to more highly prioritize the courts. And I'll say one other thing, that any time if somebody brings up in the presidential debate that is going to come up, do you support packing the court? And by that they mean, do you support expanding the Supreme Court to going from 9 to 12 justices? Don't let them call that packing. Under the hashtag watch your language, don't let them call that packing. It's already been packed. There is already a Supreme Court justice seat stolen. That is, if it is a 5-4 majority, they stole that majority. The court has already been packed. What McConnell is doing now to try to streamline all the confirmations is to further pack that court. The court is already packed. The question now is, should we expand the court? Should the Supreme Court go from 9 to 12, which is how many we have in the jury system? It's a fair debate. But make no mistake, the court has already been packed. I think it says here, Zick, I think it might be Zach, I'm not sure your name, but from Portland, Oregon, listed on X-Ray, our home station. Shout out to the app at xray.fm. Go ahead.
It's Zeke. You know me.
Oh, Zeke.
How's it going, Jefferson?
Zeke, how you doing, Zeke? They spelled your name differently.
There you go. You can call me Thunder if you want. So
it's fine, Thunder. Okay, go ahead, Thunder.
Anyway, yeah. So I just wanted to thank you for your discussion about social movement theory. I actually studied sociology in school and took an entire course on it. But that's not the point. You know, when the Trump phenomenon started emerging here, I saw it like from above, like on a cloud. The divisions that were going to emerge, right? Because we know this from history that any time a class consciousness starts to emerge, for whatever reason, we start to get fractured on lines of identity.
Yeah.
And I think there was no sort of greater representation of that than something that happened here in town, here in Portland a couple years ago with a Patriot Prayer Rally, where they were meeting at one park and surrounded by different affinity groups. We had the religious folks and the immigrant rights folks on one side. We had the Antifa and the Black Bloc on another side. We had the unions on another side surrounding these Patriot Prayer folks. And I was so disheartened by it because what I knew was going on there was everybody was getting played. Everybody was getting played to have a fight on the street, to fight amongst themselves so that they don't see the wizard behind the curtain.
And Zeke, I'll go one further. I'm forgetting his name right now. I'll need to Google it. But one of the key propaganda ministers for Putin was a former theater director. His background was and the move that he does is to create division, is to create mock, and some would say that's even what's been going on in the United States, is people sort of prodding people to get them to get their baser instincts to go out there and fight each other. That they've actually paid folks. There actually have been crisis actors, but not freaking kids who had their schools gunned down. Those aren't the crisis actors. There have been actually crisis actors who in the Ukraine, for instance, organizing violent protests. So things, see, there is division, and try to divide people up. It's an important point. I'm still trying to figure it out.
My response when I saw what was going to happen is I grabbed my bell. I grabbed my prayer bell, and I went down there and I just felt it out. I sat myself on a corner, and as people were walking around, all these different folks with these different perspectives, every once in a while I would give that bell a little bit of a ring, and it would just force people out of whatever dialogue or dramatic thing that they had going on in their heads with screaming and the back and the forth. And I did that whole day. At one point, I walked between a line of Antifa Black Bloc protesters and a line of riot cops. Just slowly meditated walking down that line between them. And
disrupting the division.
Exactly. It was a phenomenal experience, and it didn't. I'm a realist. It didn't stop the tear gas from flowing. It didn't stop the flashbangs.
Yeah.
But those flashbangs and that tear gas, when they boom, it resonates in your bone marrow.
Yeah.
And to be the antithesis to that with that bell, it was a phenomenal experience.
Well, Zeke, I want to just say thank you. We love you. Appreciate the call. Want to get to the other calls as well. Shout out to Zeke and shout out to the X-Ray family. Appreciate it. We got time for some more calls. John, been waiting patiently from Jeffersonville, Ohio. What a good name for a town.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. Hey, I have my pick for president, but before I'd like, to get into that, I'd like to explain something. One of the problems that I see is that the right, they keep their base extremely excited. And on the left, we don't. And an example of that is the impeachment series that's going on with the debate last week about impeachment. If we would have started impeachment, it would have excited a lot of the people on the left. Article 2, Section 1 of the Emulance Clause is enough to do it. And then that's not even counting campaign finance and many other issues. And that would excite the base. Plus, 23 Republican senators would have to defend everything that's going on in Congress whenever they come up for election. So it would excite the base, and it would I don't know. It just seems like the right does such a they just do.
No, I hear John. I hear what you're saying, and and I want to agree, and then I want to quibble. My agreement is, and it even goes to the last caller as well, that how do you keep a group of people together of disparate interests, disparate backgrounds? You can do it with core objectives sometimes, if you can have enough strategic initiatives, things that cut across enough value sets, enough priority sets to really bring a bunch of people together. This is essentially the argument behind the Green New Deal, that you get the working folks on the New Deal side and the environmental folks on the green side and the health advocates on the combination, perhaps. The other, and it has proven maybe even more successful, unfortunately, is to pose an enemy. It is how the United States military apparatus figured out that the way to get significant support for the application of United States military force was to really convince a lot of people in the United States that a given leader of another nation was really, really evil, and therefore they had to be destroyed. And there is and I do wrestle with this in my own heart. I think it's part of the problem that the progressive movement, if we're willing to call it that, has, is that some of the moves, some of the really effective rhetorical moves, can at other parts be antithetical to part of our raison d'etre, part of how we understand how we're supposed to move through the earth. If you came through as a peace activist, the idea of posing an enemy so you can destroy your enemy, then you went, well, does that end justify those means? I'm not sure. In fact, I think I'm not even supposed to be a big fan of the idea that the end justifies the means, so it's tricky. But I agree that making sure, so my preferred move is to organize the base not only by posing the enemy, understanding it, yes, sometimes understanding the threat, yes, fear is real, anger is real, we don't have to use only a limited portion of our emotional palette, but also try to organize as much as possible on common objectives, on democracy. We may have more time to spend on the impeachment question itself. We got a very quick one from Kenyatta on watching our language. I want to make sure that when we say Americans, we mean people in all of the Americas, I assume. Go ahead, Kenyatta.
Hey, I'm really appreciating the topic, Jeff. And yeah, you know, we're in North America, we're Americans, but it's like we have taken ownership of that term. Canadians are also Americans; they're in North America. People in Central America are Americans. And you know, when you talk about watch your language, words have consequences.
Yeah.
And I think it is one of the ways that the American people in particular are most manipulated. For instance, you take the term minority, which I happen to be a member of a minority group. But where I live in California, I represent the majority. Globally, I represent the majority. So, you know, I just wanted to kind of weigh in on that.
Appreciate it, Kenyatta. We're going to be going to break. And yeah, a challenge we have is Canada is easier to say than Canadian is easier to say than United Statesian. But U.S. American, I have found that can work pretty well, but appreciate your call. 202-808-9925. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
I'm Jeff. It's Friday. Anything Goes Friday. Also talking about the origins of the right wing and watch your language. We'll be back. Prof, you're on the air from Rock Hill, South Carolina.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you for taking my call.
Go ahead. It's good to have you.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the nuclear reactors that we have out there now. I'm not for them. I think we have a big problem with the regulatory people that are supposed to be watching them. But there is a lot better type reactors out there that we really need to get on.
What's your favorite, if you were going to invest, if you were going to hop on to something akin to some version of some green newish deal, what would be your top priority energy source?
My top energy source would be probably wind.
All right.
But there is nuclear reactors out there now. For instance, Elysium Energy has been talking about one that it's called a fast reactor.
Mm-hmm.
It uses it's a liquid salt type reactor. It uses molten salt to hold the nuclear fuel. The benefits of that is all the bad parts, the spent nuclear fuel products, stay in the salt.
So what you're saying is you're open to some kind of nuclear power, but you don't like the old nuclear reactors. You like the newer ones that might be a little bit less concerning.
A lot less concerning,
All
sir.
right.
A lot less.
right,
like I was saying, the products stay in the salt.
But then the salt. What do you do with the salt?
Excuse me.
What do you do with the salt?
Well, the salt stays solid at room temperature.
Well, yeah, but you don't want it in your living room. What do you do with it?
Well, of course not. Who would want something that has nuclear fuel anywhere near around them? I mean,
yeah, not me. So where do you put the salt? I mean, I like that it goes into salt, I guess. That's better than going straight into my living room. But it still opens the question where I need to put the salt.
In the reactor, it's used. It's the fuel. It has the fuel in it.
Yeah.
So what happens is with the old reactors, you lose your water, which is your coolant, and then the nuclear fuel gets very hot, sometimes 2,000 degrees C.
Yeah.
You have basically what they call a molten ball of fuel.
And Prof, I do want to move on to the next caller. I do appreciate your call, and we did spend a bunch of time yesterday on the nuclear thing, and I appreciate your perspective because this is, I think, the debate. There's nobody that says they want the dirtiest nuclear reactors, but there is this debate about no nukes or somewhat worse, somewhat less bad nukes. And
these are walk-away safe.
Yeah, I appreciate
a lot safer than what we have now. I mean, extremely, and we need them for space too.
Appreciate it, Prof. I'm going to go to the next caller. Rudy, you're on the air from Norwalk, watching us on YouTube.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Hi. Well, first I want to say, doing a good job. I like that you're covering for Tom. So I don't know how to phrase this question so much. So unless I'm not sure if they gave a date for the Mueller report that's going to get released. I don't know if they have or not. And so my question is,
can they be forced to? The people who can be forced to are essentially the people who are running the government. And so the only way to change that is change the people who are running the government. I apologize, my answer is somewhat simplistic, but I think it's also accurate. We're going to be right back. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff. Interesting interchange with someone who is considering leaving a meaningful portion of their estate to purpose-driven media organizations. And in fact, the meeting that I had scheduled right after the show was with somebody who wanted to talk about that very subject. We're about to bring on Luke Vargas from Talk Media News, but just wanted to say that as we think about really trying to build the social justice infrastructure, if we really think about how we advocate for democracy, how do we actually solve problems? I think of the philanthropist who puts in a bunch of money so that they can name some portion of a hospital wing after them. I think, and then, they'll give $100,000 to that or $5 million to that. And then they'll go to the politician and they'll say, aha, here's $2,500 or here's $100. And I think about how can we actually start applying the resource towards democracy that is going to be required to build a good democracy. And for the people who do donate to nonprofit and purpose-driven organizations, thank you to you. And how do we start thinking about that at the scale of the problem? Luke Vargas is with us, Talk Media News, talkmedianews.com. Appreciate you, Luke. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Can I, just like I jumped in at the last news segment and selected some criteria to measure the difference between Tom's listeners and the Limbaugh listeners.
Yes.
I want to just jump in because I was doing an interview today on this new European Union digital copyright law called Article 13, which has just been agreed to this week and is causing a lot of stir in the independent media sphere because it basically is going to raise the financial punishment for, firms like YouTube if copyrighted content appears on their platforms at all. But one of the ways that it is likely that this is going to cause a problem for independent media is that these big internet firms, which make money from hosting all sorts of content, are going to build very strict new algorithms and filtering systems to basically just immediately block from publication anything that has even a fair use amount of content in it. And I've run into problems on SoundCloud uploading my newscasts. If there's any even background music playing at a live venue while I'm doing an interview with someone, that gets flagged by Universal Media Group and I can't put my newscast up. And I think I would just say that, and I don't have a fix for this, I don't know who's offering to do this, but I've talked to some people who say, look, even when we, as independent artists or independent, media content producers, can buy tools to scan platforms like YouTube to look for people and big companies that are pirating us.
Yeah.
When we then go to YouTube, the cards are really stacked against us. YouTube makes so much more money from the major news outlets and others that use copyrighted content than they do from, going through all the trouble to listen to independent content creators. If someone out there in the legal world or in the tech world could create a way for independent creators to multiply their voices when it comes down to having to, crack down on people who are thieving their stuff and put pressure on platforms like YouTube, that would take, I think, a little bit of the, nerves away from folks in independent media who are very nervous about this.
So say that. So I want to paraphrase the first part and then ask you to explain or offer again the possible proposal, so that there is yet again demonstration by current oligarchic systems to benefit purchased speech over free speech. That the large organizations will have a better ability to police because they'll have more funding for their police, and the platform itself will favor them over the smaller contributor of content. And say again what you're thinking might be in the realm of a solution to this.
Well, yeah, so to put another angle on the law itself, just to make sure I'm saying this clearly for the listeners who I think should actually care a lot about this.
Yeah.
Because we do see this pattern, especially in internet regulation, where no one really seems to understand these issues and their consequences until it's already been passed, which I feel like kind of happened with net neutrality, and now we're all.
No, you're right. It's why we got to nerd out. It's why you're so very valuable, is because if we only pay attention to the top. I'm not calling you a nerd. Maybe that's a compliment. But But if we only take care of the top line issues, they can get away with any number of things on the stuff that's more complex. Keep going.
Okay, so the recording industry, the film industry, big news media pitched this EU rule as sort of a David versus Goliath. They were the underdog, and the big bad guys were Google and Facebook and YouTube and all these things. And it's not really the case. I mean, what they basically were sort of saying is, we want more, it's not fair that, we created all this cool content, The Daily Show, all these other videos and music and stuff. And then, Facebook's news feed is filled with all that stuff. But if you took away our content, Facebook wouldn't have such a valuation because you'd be a big empty billboard.
Yep.
And so they basically want more money from this. So they created a way to basically push YouTube to have to make big licensing, big fat deals with all the content providers in advance, so that, there's a bigger cut for the recording industry and the film industry. Now, they pitch this, though, by saying this helps independent creators and artists and stuff like that, because now they'll have ways to go after YouTube. The problem is, even in cases where, so this one composer that I follow on Twitter was basically saying, look, I paid whatever it cost to get a scanning service to look for things. And I found a news agency in Kenya, a film production company or something, that was using my composition for like a Netflix show underneath their entire news segment. And when I reported to YouTube, they said, oh, well, you only had 10 days since when it went up to take it down. And this guy was sort of gutted, saying, look, I'm playing along by the rules, but I don't have a giant legal division like Universal Media Group might have to be able to go to YouTube and demand that this gets fixed. So I guess I don't know what the solution is, but that is the space where this law probably can't be reversed. It favors big media outlets as opposed to independent media. But if there is some way to work within this law and try to create a system so that independent content providers are less overwhelmed in trying to get justice for themselves and get remuneration for their work, that would be a really useful thing to work on. And now we've used up our entire news segment. But it's still a really important thing. And
this was Article 13 of copyright law in the European Union rules?
Yes, exactly right. It's brand new this week. Again, big demonstrations, huge petitions, people trying to block it. But again, the outrage over it was never more than when it was already passed. So a big lesson learned there, I think.
Well, Luke Vargas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Talk Media News, talkmedianews.com. Appreciate it. And yeah, we do. I like it when we touch on the media stuff so much. I like it with the reference of the book, Who Will Tell the People? Ultimately, we got to work together to do that. And we'll be doing some more right after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's there's just it's there. It's there for you. And it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff. And you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great. We're reading today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club from my old friend Armin Lehmann's book, the late Armin Lehmann. The book is titled In Hitler's Bunker, a boy soldier's eyewitness account of the Fuhrer's last days. My friend Armin was the man who was the 16-year-old who gave the bad news to Hitler and then he watched as Hitler walked into the room and committed suicide. It opens with an introduction from Arthur Axmann, the leader of the Hitler Youth, in April of '45. There's only victory or annihilation. Know no bounds in your hatred of the enemy. It is your duty to watch when others tire, to stand when others weaken. Your greatest honor is your unshakable fidelity to Adolf Hitler. It was with words such as these that the Third Reich's Hitler Youth leader, Arthur Axmann, exhorted 10-year-old boys and girls being sworn into the Hitler Youth in Berlin on the eve of Adolf Hitler's last birthday. The children were being inducted into the junior echelons of the movement, the Jungvolk, the young folk, and the Jungmadel, the young maidens. I was looking on, then age 16, a member of the Hitler Youth Volkssturm, literally People's Storm. The Volkssturm was the home defense force of old men and young boys hastily assembled in the dying days of the war. Every able-bodied male between the ages of 16 and 55 was ordered to put on whatever uniform he could find, anything from postmen's uniforms to firefighters' uniforms, and fight for the fatherland. The Russians called us totals because we were the result of total war. The Wehrmacht called us stew because we were a mixture of old meat and green vegetables. However, I had recently distinguished myself in battle and had even been awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. The Hitler Youth leader, Arthur Axmann, at 32, was the youngest of the senior Nazis around Hitler, but his influence within Hitler's inner circle was growing daily toward the end of the war as he pledged that the Hitler Youth movement would fight to the death for the Führer and the fatherland. In Hitler's last days, Axmann was one of only a handful of Nazis, including Hitler's private secretary Martin Bormann and the cynical propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who enjoyed the Führer's absolute trust and confidence. Axmann had personally selected me to present to Hitler on the occasion of his 56th birthday at a ceremony in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, partly because of my recent distinction in fighting the Russians, but partly, I suspect, because my role in the Hitler Youth Unit was as a courier, a melder. Hitler had won his Iron Cross as a courier in the First World War. I think that Axmann saw that as a lucky sign of some sort. At that moment, our Führer could do with every bit of luck he could get. As I watched Axmann, I did not realize it, but victory for the Allies was no longer in doubt. Germany was being overrun from every direction. City after city was being turned into ash under a ferocious Allied bombing campaign, unprecedented in its intensity. I, along with several hundred other teenage soldiers of the Hitler Youth Volkssturm, was among the last who would serve Hitler's regime in Berlin in the much vaunted citadel of the Fuhrer's last redoubt in the dying days of the war. I didn't know it at the time, but I would soon be serving as a courier in his bunker beneath the Chancellery. It was an experience that would bring me into contact with some of the most notorious Nazis of the time, as well as some of the most decent soldiers and civilians struggling to cope with the death wish Hitler had imposed upon all Germans. Facing total defeat, the Fuhrer was now willing to sacrifice everything and everybody, including even the youngest and most innocent of German lives. It wasn't just males either. The Bund Deutscher Model, the German Girls' Legion, or BDM, was the female section of the Hitler Youth. They too sacrificed their lives for the Fuhrer. I did not realize at the time that Germany faced total defeat. I still believed in the myth of our, quote, miracle weapons that was widely circulated before the end of the war. I had no comprehension of the sheer evil that was at the heart of the Nazi regime. Yet I was prepared to lay down my life for Hitler in defense of the fatherland and the noble ideals of the National Socialist movement. I was elated at the prospect of greeting Hitler the following morning on his 56th and last birthday. To comprehend why anybody can have been so thoroughly taken in by such a deception, one must understand a little about my background. I was 4 years old when Adolf Hitler became Reich Chancellor of a coalition cabinet in Germany. It was 30 January 1933. Later, that historic date became known as die Machtübertragung, the seizure of might. Absolute power, as Hitler has taught us, often brings about primal chaos. But in Hitler's case, it went beyond that. His absolute control over the minds of countless individuals created a living hell that destroyed the lives of millions of people in a human catastrophe too enormous to comprehend. It wasn't like that in the beginning. It all started with promises of a better life. My grandfather, for example, an old guard Nazi Party member and an early follower of Hitler, was convinced that a fast economic recovery would come about because of Hitler. It did. He was also sure that Germany would be avenged for the Treaty of Versailles. It was. My father believed in Hitler as well. He not only became a member of the National Socialist Workers' Party, as thousands did, and joined the SS, he also turned into a fanatical disciple of what he looked upon as the new order needed to restore Germany to the glory it deserved. My father was an authoritarian, so perhaps it's understandable that he admired the new regime. But my mother was as loving and caring a soul as you could possibly imagine, and she too admired Adolf Hitler. She too thought Adolf Hitler had been anointed by God to lead Germany to its historic destiny as the greatest nation on earth. Most Germans did. It may come as a shock or a mild surprise, but women were among Hitler's most ardent followers in Hitler's bunker.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jefferson Smith, and we are in the 15th hour. 5 days this week, we sat together, 3 hours a day. We are now in the final hour of this spring break, of this substitute teacher, of this opportunity to keep our community together, hopefully grow it. Thank you to all the people who have been interacting, who have been calling in. The call-in number again is 202-808-9925. We will do a speed round, I promise. Be able to make sure we get through the calls. Also, you can tweet us at Thom Hartmann. You can tweet me at Jefferson D. Smith, and I'll get to some of those tweets. Let's get to some of the calls as well. We talked about the history of the right wing. We talked also, we did some watch your language. I may do a quick summary of some of that. There's this other question, though, and that is that I teased the beginning and I need to make sure we get to, which is, do we care about policy? When presidents decide they want to run, and most of them don't end up being presidents, when candidates announce, and they work with their consultants on what their strategy should be, how they should open their candidacy, what their key messages should be, how much does policy matter? How much do ideas matter? How much does it matter what they're going to do? I want to put two candidates in not entirely false, but at least convenient opposition. Beto O'Rourke and Elizabeth Warren. Beto O'Rourke rises to fame because he looks like somebody who might be able to beat Ted Cruz. People get very, very excited about that. Runs a ton of money. Actually, raises a ton of money. Doesn't quite win. Now he's running for president. Former member of Congress. He's got some credential. Announces his candidacy, viral video, hops on a table, talks to a bunch of people. He is tall, looks like a leader, says the patriarchy. And by the way, I'm someone who's benefited from the same patriarchy. I'm not throwing stones at Beto O'Rourke. I'm going to be super excited about any number of candidates who ended up being nominated to run against Donald Trump. Any number of them. I'm almost prepared to say any of them. And not just tolerating them. I mean, actually genuinely excited. First, Elizabeth Warren, who's come out with more policy papers than any candidate I have ever seen. More specific ideas than any candidate I've ever seen. And I listened to a discussion about this. Somebody I very often agree with, Matt Iglesias, was sort of criticizing her approach, saying, well, how much does it really matter? The president doesn't get to make all of the policy decisions. Now, if they really disagree directionally on some critical issue, on immigration, on a woman's right to choose, on marginal tax rates, on health care, if they really disagree in a directional way on antitrust enforcement, that matters. But, you know, that they have detailed policies, does that really matter? Does it matter in winning? Donald Trump didn't. Does it matter in governing? Well, a lot of that will be done by Congress anyway. I'd be interested in your view. 202-808-9925. My view is that it matters, and I'll offer that after we take some phone calls. Let's go to Maine from WCPT. Ain't Afraid of Me, Chicago, Illinois. How you doing, Maine?
Hey, I'm doing okay. Yeah, I wanted to talk about, you know, what they're calling us social. When we want to go into having free health care and free education and like paying student athletes and stuff like that, and how they want to call this socialism. But what about their privatization? They want to privatize. They want us to pay for our democracy through privatization. They're looking for this profit. And we allow capitalism because of democracy. And we could actually end capitalism and get and have some other type of economic system. We don't have to have capitalism. We have it because our democracy, and we allow it to happen. But we have to go back into our democracy and provide for the general welfare in order to promote domestic tranquility. That's the government's job or duty to do this for the people of America. Amen. And this is why I feel that Trump hates America. He hates the people of America. This is why he's doing what he's doing to the people of America. We have to see ourselves as all of us, red, brown, black, blue, whatever. If you're an American, he's attacking all of us. And this is, you know, through and these little things of like privatization, wanting to our public schools, wanting to have these different other schools other than our public schools. You know, so that
I think you've given me how we're going to close the show today. We're not closing the show yet, but I always want to think about, if we're going to put something to music, what's the big point we want to make? And I think connecting democracy, connecting the stuff that our community, that our pro-democracy community is working on, calling it about, discussing today and on other days, connecting that to the best parts of this country. I think that's going to be our big finish. I don't want to cut you off if you want to finish your point. Well, we have to see that they want to privatize anything that they call that they want to call socialization, which is actually our democracy, and we're fighting for our democracy with these issues because they want to look at us. We talk about European countries like Norway and Sweden and stuff like that, but these countries don't have the problems we have. And here we have a multi-trillion-dollar America, and we should be able to have free education and health care and not privatize all these things just for their profit. Amen. And this is the debate. You can say it in a lot of different ways. But the market fundamentalists, and I'll give another watch your language, screw the idea of free market. Who's it free for? You get stuff free? Who does it make free? Isn't that free? Calling that freedom when what it actually is unfettered application of the power of capital. One of the big lies of the 20th and 21st centuries. One of the big, big lies. And if we think that one of the things we need for real freedom is not only so inherited wealth is unfettered, but so that you can actually have a life that includes choices, where you can actually do stuff. That includes democracy. The privatization of the social justice infrastructure, the privatization of public structures, hashtag watch your language, public structures, the privatization, as Maine said, of our democracy, I guess what I'll just say is amen. Jacob on TuneIn, Berkeley, go ahead. Berkeley, Michigan, I think. Jacob, you there? Oh, we lost Jacob. Lee, you'll be the last point of this segment. You got about 35 seconds. Go ahead, Lee from Sterling, Virginia. Excuse me.
Lightning round. Yeah, lightning round answer. So president should be general electability, general vision, right, and leadership, not detailed policy. On your philanthropy, that money used to be our money, but over the course of my lifetime, we moved $25 trillion. We changed the rules, and we moved $25 trillion from us to them, and now they're giving a tiny bit of it back. On immigration, the issue that your previous guest was talking about, that's not a little issue. That's not a little difference between Trump and conservatism. That's a big issue that drives politics. Here, it does it in Europe, and there's liberal cases to be made for immigration reform because it drives down the price of labor, and it can dilute progressivism if you allow ultra-conservatives to immigrate at too big of a number. So that's my lightning round. Thank you.
Lee, thank you so much from Sterling, Virginia. We'll be right back. This is the Thom Hartmann Show, and I'll give you my thoughts on the question of policy versus vision, or policy and vision. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. Approaching the big, big finish, 202-808-9925. Lightning round coming up. We're on with Norma from Montgomery, Alabama, wants to talk about the ACA. Go ahead, Norma.
Thank you, Jeff. If you're watching any of the news, you see Trump out on his presidential rallies talking about how we are finally going to get rid of Obamacare. Most of these people who have spent the last 10 years watching what I call Fox Not News don't even understand that Obamacare is the Affordable Care Act. And when you destroy that and you move more people off of health care, we have a national emergency, in my opinion. There is a bill coming up sponsored by Senator Sanders to provide expanded health care for everybody. The reason we have to have everybody on a type of expanded Medicare for all, covering everything from physical, vision, hearing, mental, and physical therapy things, this is necessary for our own safety, because if you go out to eat, you don't know what you're eating. Here we had another outbreak of hepatitis A in which the restaurant was closed. They never did an expanded Medicare here because we had a Republican governor. We still have one. And we have had 8 outbreaks of tuberculosis here. And so you go out and you get yourself a salad. Does it have a little TB sauce on it? So if you teach people about this, how to get expanded Medicare, they don't understand that they're paying 2.65% of their paycheck. If it were raised to, say, 5%, and people are going, oh, that's a lot. Well, if you make a flat $10 an hour and you actually get to work a whole 40 hours a week, that's $400 a week. And if you multiply the 5% times the $400, that is a $20 bill, which works out to $1,040 a year to provide you with medical health care. And we will no longer have a Blue Cross Blue Shield CEO talking about the fact that $21 million a year is an inadequate salary. $21 million. Do the math on that. He has a 40-hour week. They're 52 weeks. He has 2,080 work hours. You divide that into the $21 million, that's a little over $10,000 an hour. And so here we are with our fellow citizens struggling to pay for health care that does not want to cover this. Oh, you have a pre-existing condition? That's too bad. We're not going to cover you anymore unless you give us another $500 a month or whatever. And so if you divide that 2,080 work hours for a year into the $21 million, it's a little over $10,000 an hour. So in the first day of the first month of the year, he is making over $40,000 that morning.
Understood. Understand the point, Norma, that the healthcare executives are making a ton. They might work more than 40 hours, but that's still lots of money per hour. And you wanted to plug the bill. Anything else you wanted to make sure you plug?
Well, like you said, we cannot afford to have everything in this country privatized because people need to understand that we human beings are not a resource for the rich. Our paychecks are not the property of the rich. We were born free, and we have the right to keep our money and buy a home and be free.
Preach it, Norma. Appreciate the time. You've been listening to the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm going to be making a case that if you love the country and if you're willing to dance with the notion of patriotism, the best parts of it, that there is a unique opportunity at this time in history. That's how we're going to close the show. But before that, we're going to be right back with a speed round. This is Tom's show. I'm Jeff. It's Friday. Maria, Evanston, Illinois, on languaging from WCPT. And afraid of me, go ahead.
Hi, Jefferson. Can you hear me, or should I get off a speaker?
No, I can hear you.
Okay. I just want to tell you, every time you fill in, you do a great job.
Thanks so much.
And I always love to hear your perspective.
Appreciate that.
And I really think languaging is so important for our party because we're not good at it. And the Republicans are so good at it. And they steal it and capture the minds of Americans that don't really get it. So if you come up with wonderful ideas and spread it as much as you can, when Norman Goldman was on, he always said that instead of using midterm elections, saying that it was congressional
elections, they really matter.
Yeah.
I'm throwing that one on the list. Thank you. You're totally right, Maria.
And to come up with another word, since socialist is so loaded, that we're Democrats for democracy.
Yeah.
However that can be put.
I just think I don't even say the word Democrat. I mean, I'm happy to say it in various contexts. But the thing I find myself starting to say is just we need to build a pro-democracy coalition. And I don't say that covers everything, and I'm not trying to speak for everyone. But for me, for the stuff that I prioritize personally, and that I hope is not entirely just personal, that I just talk about, we need a pro-democracy movement, and if they want to demonstrate, if people who are opposed to people voting, or people who want unlimited secret money, for people who want to draw districts so that they look like a strange paperclip, for people who want to close down voting centers and not have protected ballots, for those folks who want to say, oh, I'm a pro-democracy, all right, but prove it, and prove it from a policy perspective.
Yeah.
All right. I appreciate it, Maria.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, KBCS from Washington. Is it Quilcene, Washington?
Quilcene, sir.
All right, go ahead.
Well, I had two things I wanted, but your screener said not to do one, so I'm going to go on with the shooters.
Okay.
The one thing that is common with all the shootings we have is these people have irresolved conflicts. If we should start at the earliest age in school and at least go through grade 12, doing conflict resolution, and restorative justice. I think we'd be far ahead and change our culture. Now, if you're willing, I'll go on with watch your language, because some of it has to do with what you speak.
If you've got one phrase you want us to learn, speak the phrase.
Okay, I will go very quickly. 3 definitions. Dumb is without sound. Ignorance is without facts. Stupidity is the inability to process facts. Let's hear you expound, sir. Good day.
All right, thanks a bunch. In the parse between you said dumb, ignorant, and stupidity. In the parsing of that, I will say it is not my highest priority. I like the word dumb because I think it's funny, and I usually use it to describe myself, not because I try to be ignorant, not because I would define myself as a stupid person, and not because I lack the inability to speak. It's just because it's the funniest word. And I try not to describe too many people like that. And in fact, when I use the word dum-dum to describe the president, it is to critique the strategy of calling him a dum-dum, because I don't think that's that great a strategy. So I don't know if that's expounding, but it's something. My agreement is, I couldn't agree more. In fact, we had the caller earlier who was saying, if we first dealt with blank, and he talked about stuff I totally agreed with, and talked about how we need to address our democracy and make it better, and that we got to start there, and I totally agreed. But I also believe in not just the tyranny of or, but the genius of and. And I think we have to address ourselves. And I think we have to address our culture. And, as you said, good sir, we have to work with our young people so that they are better able to cope with conflict. I could have used that. I know a lot of people could have used that. And it's never too late to get a little bit better. And we need to start getting a little bit better rather than keeping it a lot worse. My one quibble, under hashtag watch your language. I don't like shooter. I like mass murderer. A shooter, you can do that in a video game. You can be a first-person shooter. It puts all of the attention on the person doing the deed, none of the attention on the person getting harmed. It can be, oh, I'd like to go shooting. That's fun. Let's go on a shooting range. There isn't a murder range. There shouldn't be one. These people should not be glorified. It should be clear that they are murderers. You can say gun murder. You can say gun violence. You can say mass murder. If they didn't kill anybody, you can say attempted murderer. But I think it lets them off the hook. They like to glorify themselves. They might even like to think of themselves as, oh, I'll be a shooter. Nah. We don't want shooters because we don't want murderers. Anyway, I'm not like the word police, but I recognize we don't have Madison Avenue working overtime to create the best language for pro-democracy movements. So we can help one another. And I collect the stuff we hear. Jeff from X-Ray, a different Jeff from probably the same X-Ray in Portland, Oregon. Go ahead.
Yeah, hey, Jeff. Great job this week, and thanks for taking my call.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. I used to play baseball with a kid named Jeff Smith. He wasn't as cerebral as you, but he was a big hitter. And I don't know if you ever play baseball, but you always do a great job pinch hitting for Tom when he's on his well-deserved break. So anyway, I know the emphasis this week has been on what actions we can take to win the future. That's something Norman Gomez used to say. Somebody just mentioned him. Yeah. But I want to shift the focus to our attitudes and motivations for getting there. In my opinion, what we've been up against for the last 40 years is the Republican Party that is the party of nay, and I don't mean Bob Nay. I mean nay as in no way, no how, no can do, to everything and anything that doesn't help the rich get richer. That was what Reagan brought us. That's what Reaganism is. Let's help the rich get richer, and somehow it'll magically help everybody else. Yeah. And that's all the modern GOP and some corporate Dems stand for. And we now unequivocally know it's been a complete abject failure for our country. So, Jeff, the challenge, as I see it for Democrats, is to challenge our moral outrage into righteous determination and the audacity to plan big and dream bigger.
Will you say those words again? Will you say those exact words again?
Righteous determination and audacity to plan big and dream bigger. That's what FDR did, JFK did with the man on the moon, LBJ, Great Society, and now we got Elizabeth, Bernie, AOC with Medicare and the Green New Deal. Let's get behind them. Let's get active, like Tom said. Let's do it with confidence and swagger. History's on our side, and yes, we can.
Preach. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We're getting close to the big finish, and how this is a time to seize the best parts of this country, the best ideas of this country for pro-democracy.
book today is The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America by Greg Grandin. And this is from Chapter 1, entitled All That Space. The British colonies in North America were conceived in expansion. America was an aspiration, an errand, and an obligation born out of violent Christian schism and Europe's interminable religious and imperial conflicts. Depending on the intricacies of their particular interpretations of Revelation, the Protestants who settled New England might have understood flight across the Atlantic as a way of escaping European war, or they might have seen migration as a chance to open a new front and win those wars on a new soil. Here in the 1600s, in the eschatological nebula of the New World, was the first paradoxical image of America as simultaneously pristine and despoiled, empty and at the same time filled with primitives begging for deliverance, subordinated to Catholic Spain, which had conquered its part of the Americas a century earlier and stood as the great obstacle to Reformation England's rise as a world power. All yell and cry with one voice, Libertia, Libertia, Richard Hakluyt, a clergyman and court minister, wrote in the late 1500s, hoping to convince investors and his queen to establish an American colony. As Puritan society frayed under the harsh conditions of settler life, the frontier threatened and beckoned. The dark woods were filled with witches, and they were witchy, inviting hither. The forest was the place where the community could be redeemed and given new purpose, a chance to once again start anew, or it could be a place of more sorrows, wilderness sorrows, as two early Puritan patriarchs described the hardships that awaited those who ventured into uncharted territory, where whatever solidarity existed would be smashed into atoms as settlers scattered to escape the rule of the clergy. People are ready to run wild into the woods again and to be as heathenish as ever, warned Increase Mather. Expansions could be, often in the same sermon, held up as the cause of and the solution to the difficulties of establishing Christian communities. Either way, Native Americans had to get out of the way. They could die. They waste, they molder away, they disappear, said one Puritan chronicler of indigenous people who had succumbed to European pestilence years before the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620, thus clearing the earth for the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. God made way for his people by removing the heathen and planting them in the ground, said another observer. They could be murdered. The holy terror unleashed by the Puritans was, according to the historian Bernard Bailyn, driven by fears of what could happen to civilized people in an unimaginable wilderness and fears of racial conflicts in which God's children were fated to struggle with pitiless agents of Satan, pagan antichrists swarming in the world around them. Survivors could be enslaved. The first patent granted in colonial America in 1626 was to a Virginia merchant and planter, William Claiborne, for inventing a device that would not just restrain Indians, but also make them work. Claiborne was given an Indian to experiment on for the trial of his invention. Colonial records do not say what this innovation might have been, only noting that it was not successful. Or they could be pushed further and further west. The prodigious and relentless population, complained New Orleans Spanish governor in 1794, progressively drives the Indian nations before them and upon us, seeking to possess for itself this vast continent which the Indians occupy between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Appalachian Mountains. More than a century and a half later, writing in the early 1950s, the Mexican author and diplomat Octavio Paz made much the same point. America was, he writes, if anything, geography, pure space, open to human action. Since it lacked historical substance, ancient social classes, established institutions, religions, and hereditary laws, reality presented no obstacles other than natural ones. Men struggled not against history, but against nature. And wherever there was an historical obstacle, indigenous societies say, it was simply erased from history, reduced to a mere natural fact and dispensed with accordingly. Evil is outside, part of the natural world, like Indians, rivers, mountains, and other obstacles that must be domesticated or destroyed. End of quote. The American Revolution is a permanent revolution, Paz went on, a nonstop expulsion of, quote, all elements foreign to the American essence and a constant invention of itself. And anything that stands in the way of that invention, anything that is in any way irreducible or inassimilable, to perpetual creation, be it Native Americans, Spanish America, or history itself, quote, is not American. Quote, in other places, the future is one of man's attributes because we are men. We have a future. In Saxon America, the process is inverted and the future determines the man. We are men because we are the future, and everything that has no future is not a man. End of quote. The United States, Paz said, offers no room for contradictions, ambiguity, or conflict. The nation flies forward swiftly as if weightless across the land. Trying to stop North Americans moving west, Stephen Austin, the founder of Texas, said over a century earlier, was like trying to stop the Mississippi with a dam of straw. The drive west waxed and waned and burst forward with great passion during key moments. The book, The Edge of the Myth, by Greg Grandin.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hey, everybody. It's almost time for the big finish. The discussion of whether policy matters, let me offer my quick thoughts. The short answer is I think it does. The Iglesias point and the point by one of our callers was, what I care about is not the policy details during presidential campaign, but is the big vision. And the argument there is a strong one, because big vision is what moves people. We can organize more easily around big vision rather than expecting that 50 million of us are going to read the same set of 15-page white papers. Totally agree. At the same time, I think policy really matters. And I think rewarding candidates who lead with it should be rewarded. And here's some reasons. One, because it encourages others to care about policy. There isn't really another chance to talk about it. The campaign is really the chance that you have. Once you start governing, you're governing. This idea that Organizing for America, that Obama for America was going to still be going around and Barack Obama was still going to be doing rallies around the country. What president would ever keep doing rallies around the country? Oh, wait, I guess somebody did. But that if we use the time for a campaign to delve into what we need to do as a country, it's good, because when the heck else are we going to do it? Second, another reason I like presidential candidates who lead with policy, including detailed policy, it gets your team ready. I remember a governor we had in our state. Wasn't a particularly great governor. His first term was pretty bad. His second term was a little better. The difference, during the first campaign, he didn't run on anything. For the second campaign, he ran on some things. And what happened? Well, everybody knew that what needed to get worked on, and they started working on it. When you're president, you have a huge apparatus. And in fact, you have more of an apparatus than you have time to meet with. If you can spend the year, and geez, we're spending now more like over 18, 20 months on preparing your team on what the priorities are, then you don't have to pretend you're going to be able to do that during the very brief transition period. You can get your team ready, and they can start working on those priorities, because a lot of it's already planned out. And there doesn't have to be debate. What does the president think? Well, can we get a meeting with the president? Well, the day is booked. You know, well, Jesus, it's going to take more than one meeting. How are we going to figure this out? Get some of it started beforehand. Also, to prove one's awareness and understanding. One reason I think we should reward and appreciate people who lead with policy, the reason I think it's a smart political move, or at least a virtuous one, is so that when we're evaluating candidates, we're not just evaluating candidates whether they look like a leader, because frankly, our view of what looks like a leader is outdated. And trying to judge based on content can even level the playing field to some degree. And see if someone's making stuff up. Are they going to be the person in the room that has to be convinced or taught or of everything? Are they going to be somebody who is too easily fooled? Or are they going to be somebody also who in the room, when they're in that meeting, is making the meeting a little smarter, a little better, a little more likely to be a pro-democracy, pro-human being result? And then just a political one. I think it's smart. The Beto O'Rourke jump on a table versus Elizabeth Warren produce more detailed policy proposals than any other presidential candidate I've ever seen. To say not, much more than any congressional candidate, mayoral candidate, anybody I've ever seen. It's smart politically because it seizes ground earlier. If she comes out with her child care plan. She comes out with her antitrust plan. She comes out with her health plan, et cetera. Somebody else got 1 or 2. She got like, what, 12? When the subject will come up. And somebody else who takes it on has got to then respond to her thing. And if she can do that, or somebody says, oh, wait till the policy stuff till later. I think it's smart. I think it's not only virtuous, I think it's smart. That's my view. If there's only that and no big vision, if there's no core principle, if you can't boil it down to a few words, I like pro-democracy. I like saving the planet, saving democracy, and saving the middle class. I like being able to get it just a few words that I can understand and remember and organize my thoughts. It's very useful. And I really like someone who's done the reading. I really like someone who's prepared to nerd out. I really like someone who's smarter than some of their advisors, at least on some stuff. That's my take. Jacob from Berkeley, Michigan. We're going to try again. Go ahead, Jacob. We're not going to try again. Ivan from Bartlett, Illinois. Go ahead.
Hey, great job, Jefferson.
Thanks,
Give me
man.
about 30 seconds, brother.
Go ahead.
I've heard for the last couple of days several reports on progressive sites. And sorry, I can't name them on the top of my head. But I'm hearing that the DCC, the DCCC, is threatening to pull funding from consultants if they support progressive candidates running against incumbent Democrats in the 2020 congressional campaign. In other words, if this is true, and I, like I say, I'm not positive it's true. I'm just hearing these reports. If this is true, the DCC does not want to see any more AOC or Illions. What do you think?
I'm glad you brought it up. I figured it would come up this week. I had actually thought that I would probably bring it up. But I need to first understand the depth of the proposal and what's actually been decided. The characterization of it is, as you have said, that it is a limitation of folks who challenge in primaries. I have still a host of questions about, well, under what circumstances, et cetera. But, and I do think it is legitimate for a party to think about where it strategically can best put its resources. And where I land on that is more on the Howard Dean side than on the Terry McAuliffe side. Where I do land is a 50-state strategy to empower human beings, not only treat elections as a math problem, they are a math problem, but also recognize that we need to be cultivating more and engaging more and make sure people calling from Tahlequah, Oklahoma aren't left out from the debate just because they don't have a nearby swing district. And it does concern me, and it's one of the reasons I think people should get involved in the Democratic Party to make sure the Democratic Party practices some democracy. I recognize the Democratic Party can make the argument is there to save democracy rather than merely practice it. I even think that's a good idea sometimes to make sure certain decisions are just made. Where I go that I am sure of is this is why we've got to change the financial structure. It's why we've got to change campaign finance rules. Why we've got to push for publicly financed elections. And we've got to change the math on what it takes to get power. Because people in power will work for the system that maintains that power. We need a system that is more likely to overlap with pro-democracy results. I could say a lot more on that, but that is saying some. Let's go to Ron, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Go ahead, Ron.
Hi, Jefferson. Thanks. A couple of years ago, I called into Tom and mentioned a couple of words. You're talking about words now, too. I called in late started listening about 25 minutes ago.
Sure.
And I mentioned the words republify and demarketize. They obviously play on other words. Republican, republic, res public, the public thing, the commons. And demarketize plays, of course, on democratize.
Yeah.
The idea is that we're going to save our commons and give another twist to the problem rather than talking about letting other people call us socialists. We say, no, we're for demarketizing and republifying. In other words, reversing privatization of that which belongs to the whole body of people. And
I appreciate it.
Using words
republify and remarketize. I'll jot them down so I remember them. Appreciate it. Let's go to John from Seattle, Washington. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just wanted to express a concern about relying on our leaders, our elected officials. And what I mean by that is, that's just that we need to address leadership. We have an idiot or narcissist in chief that needs to be replaced, certainly. But we need to build at the grassroots. We need to spend at least as much energy organizing for school boards, for everything on the local level, on issues, et cetera.
Preach.
And not just focus on elected officials. We learned that with Obama.
I, at the risk of just repeating you, I would just repeat you. Instead, I will say thank you, John. Kirk from Ukiah. Go ahead, Kirk.
Hello, and thanks for what you do. I'm a long-time listener, and I've been listening to you all week. You're doing a great job. And I'd be good for the lightning round because all I want to say is it's more important than ever to get out the vote. My takeaway from the Mueller report and the Barr whitewash is that very traditional Republicans have drank the Kool-Aid, and that's all I want to say. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Amen. And I will say, I want to combine what you said with what our last caller said. We said work at that local, work at that grassroots level. Here's a word, here's a phrase that I will offer. Reverse coattails. So we all know about coattails, right? Worry about the top of the ballot, that helps down the ticket. And that's true. What we also know is that not everybody, most people, the vast majority, but some people don't go all the way down the ballot. On our ballots, the last thing are the judges. A lot of them are uncontested. Sometimes people don't get all the way down to the judges. But sometimes they also miss some of the state legislative candidates. And in fact, we have had legislative seats that have been decided by fewer votes than the undervote. The number of people who voted at the top of the ticket for the presidential race, or the U.S. Senate race, or the governor's race, but that didn't fill out that state legislative ballot, didn't check that box. If you go and work for one of those down ticket races, one of those critical races for the school board, the state legislature, city council, guess what? Anybody you get out to vote is going to fill out the rest of the ballot. Reverse coattails. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm starting to get a little bit sad. Big finish coming up, though, and it's not going to be sad. It's going to be great. Terry in Ventura, California, thank you for watching on Free Speech TV.
Hi, Jeff. I must agree with previous callers. You're doing an awesome job. You preach with passion, and your ideas are very insightful. Okay.
Any call that says nice that's an excellent call. I suspect you want to say something else, but if you ended it there, it would not offend me.
My topic, Jeff, very much is in keeping with today's general themes, okay, of our democracy. My topic really is gerrymandering and the Electoral College and how to achieve that. And I get these appeals from Elizabeth Warren. Usually they end up from a request for money, which is good, but one of her main themes right now is the Electoral College. And as you know, Jeff, Eric Holder and Barack Obama, and Eric Holder is the instrument person for that, is trying to undo gerrymandering and probably the Electoral College. My point, if we think we're going to achieve that by going through the normal constitutional amendment process, I think you have your head in the clouds, okay? It's not going to happen. Getting the legislature of Kansas or Oklahoma to pass that is just, it's not going to happen. So my point, how to achieve that? If you look at the states that have some degree of direct democracy, okay? You could go about at least having in a majority of states restrictions put on the ability to gerrymander and change the Electoral College via the national popular vote. You're aware of that, right? I'm sure, right,
Sure.
Jeff?
Yeah, it looks like they're going to pass it in our state. and it's been blocked for a while. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Up until recently, Oregon hasn't been on the list of those that approved it.
No, it hasn't been on the list. In fact, the head of the state Senate in Oregon has blocked it, and just got word in the last week or so that maybe releasing that block, and it ought to have the votes to pass. We'll see.
Previously, the Oregon Senate was Republican.
No, it was Democrat. But there have been people, and this gets in the weeds a little bit, but there have been people who are concerned that when they represent smaller states, that the national popular vote will mean that the only thing people care about is, New York, Texas, Florida, and California, and that states like Oregon won't get as much attention. And there is an argument there where I land, but the reason I'm in favor of the national popular vote is actually a pretty simplistic argument by a friend of mine who was a legislator and a teacher. And he said, listen, I teach 8th grade. I don't expect my 8th grade students to understand everything that I do here in the legislature. There's some things that I recognize they might not get. But I think my 8th graders ought to be able to understand how we elect the president and how come and who's supposed to win and why. And the 8th grader argument, that convinced me.
Jeff, the point I wanted to make, though, direct democracy, would you believe the reddest states, if you look on the map of states that have very limited or no direct democracy, tend to be the reddest states, like South Carolina? You can't even recall.
Yeah, no, it's the onward suite. Yeah, we're heading to break, but in the movement west, although there's some western states that have direct democracy that are pretty red. But yeah, the direct democracy didn't get started until about the Oregon system in the early part of the 20th century, after a lot of those other states had already gotten started. We'll be back. We're back. These people have been waiting patiently. We're going to give them like 15 seconds each to be kind. Let's see if they can do it. Paul, speed round. Go ahead.
Hi, Jeff. It's Paul. I'm going to try to advocate for Elizabeth Warren as the #1 most likely to beat Donald Trump, and also probably the best alternative among the Democratic nominees that are all vying for the position.
Appreciate that. James, Spokane, Washington, you got 15 seconds. He just plugged Elizabeth Warren. What do you want to do?
Yeah, I'm here. 1 minute.
Oh, we don't have the minute. Sorry. Bob, Mueller report from Tahlequah, Oklahoma. We got Tahlequah, Oklahoma.
Well, I thought you mentioned Tahlequah.
Tahlequah. See, I don't even know how to pronounce it. There you go.
Yeah, it's called Tahlequah, and it's the Cherokee capital of the nation now.
Oh, well, thank you very much. You got 10 seconds. Go ahead.
In regards to what you're saying, I got to address this very quickly. Gerrymandering. Northeastern Oklahoma has been primarily Democratic for a long time, but they changed the situation to include the lower half of the eastern state, which is primarily Little Dixie. So that was a bad mark there.
Make the point. You got about 5 seconds.
Okay, well, Citizens United is nothing but Corporations United. And the point I was wanting to make about the Mueller report is we need to have it and have it now, and all of it. It's ours.
Agreed. Nate, cue it up. So I want to say thank you. I'm going to start. Mike, you got to have the last word among a caller. You want to say we need to speak the truth. And the Valkyries are riding behind you. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. Jeff, you're doing a great job. I love Tom. Love his guests. And I'm sick of the lies. World War I, a lie. II, a lie. JFK assassination, a lie. Iraq wars, lies. Let's just concentrate on that. The Republican Party are liars, murderers, and they're liars.
Appreciate your call. And I want to start by saying thank you. We've done it this week with you. We have proposed the decathlon between the listeners of this program and the listeners of other programs. I am confident that our listeners could win that decathlon. I don't know if they would jump the furthest or run the fastest or stand the tallest, but I'm convinced that a larger percentage of them could locate a given country near where it actually exists on a globe. They could actually name some piece of policy they care about and how it's connected to some piece of fact that is in fact true. And I'm so grateful to this community that is working not only to elect a particular person or a particular set of people, but also working for democracy itself. Behind us are the Valkyries. I kind of wanted to go with Bach. Nate wanted Wagner. Nate won. But I do want to say this. There is a time right now for the pro-democracy movement. And if you are a member of the biggest political party in the country, the Democratic Party, there's an opportunity for that political party. And it offers a reflection of the story of America. A party trying to get better in a nation trying to get better. Starting out with advocating for working farmers during an agrarian age, moving into the machine age, working to overcome control by corrupt political machines, working the past 60 years to overcome its own entrenched racism, becoming a party that is advocating for equality and opportunity for everybody. As imperfect as our country is, working to get better. The party that is dominating the country right now is offering almost an opposite story. Starting with Abraham Lincoln and emancipation, then supporting women's suffrage, then co-opted by corporate power in the McKinley era, and after Teddy Roosevelt's part of the progressive era, spending the 20th century shedding progressive vestiges, the Southern strategy, making way to attacks on social justice infrastructure and the middle class, to supercharging wealth disparities and tanking the economy in the 2000s. And now to the current occupant of the office, praising those celebrating the Confederacy. This president didn't elect himself. If Ulysses S. Grant had seen leaders of his party celebrating the Confederacy, he would have driven him to drink. That is the extent of my Ulysses S. Grant material. And now there is a party that is poised to champion a new patriotism, or to set aside party labels, a pro-democracy movement that can champion a new patriotism, the best parts of this deeply imperfect country. For most of my life, conservatives have covered themselves in the American flag and questioned the patriotism of progressives. For some of us in the 80s, there was some discomfort in trumpeting patriotism. But now, fighting for equality, opportunity, peace, this is fighting for America, for the United States. Oligarchy is un-American. The Gilded Age was un-American. Inequality is un-American. Undermining democracy, suppressing votes, rigging districts, fighting for secret money in elections, that is un-American. Working to dismantle the American-led international coalition that emerged after World War II in favor of a right-wing network that is called nationalist, but is internationalist and united for racism. Standing up for the Confederacy and its symbols. Working with foreign oligarchs and foreign agents to influence American elections. Those are the precise textbook embodiments of un-American. Advancing international cooperation on issues like climate change, nuclear proliferation, is more important for thriving domestically. The pro-democracy movement, as imperfect as it is more than ever America's movement. You are the coalition of the benevolently irrational, the good people doing good things for no good reason. And because of you, democracy is possible, and you are priceless. Definition of priceless, worth a lot, not for sale. It's been an honor to be with you. I'm Jeff. Tom will be back next week. We love you.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
We say fight back!